صباح الخير يا جماعة. اليوم إن شاء الله رح يكون أكثر كيف أقول لكم من إنه رح يكون كودينج أو من هذا الحكي، لأنه زي ما حكينا أو آخر يومين كنا بس عم نقول لكم كيف بنحسبهم على الاس بي اس اس، يعني عم نعطيكم الكوماند أو الأمر عشان كيف تحسبوا. يعني هي نفسها العملية الرياضية بنحطها للانديكيتر أو المؤشر، بس بدنا نعرف انه بتختلف من برنامج لبرنامج. يعني اذا انت بتستخدم اس بي اس اس بدك تعرف شو بتستخدم الامر. اذا بتستخدم ستاتا مثلا في لها امر معين. يعني هاي الاشياء انه مو صعبه، يعني ما تحطوا ببالكم انها صعبه قد ما هي انه تعويد. زي ما قلت لكم يعني مثلا مرات كثير بقعد شهر بدون ما اعمل انا تحليل. عن جد بدي وقت، يعني تقريبا ساعه ساعتين لارجع انه اكون مثلا سريع زي قبل، لانه هي زي لغه، اذا انت you don't practice it او ما تتمرن عليها بتنساها. فاحنا حبينا مثلا الاس بي اس اس، لانه سالنا مين اكثر شيء بتستخدموه البرنامج غير الاكسل، طبعا قلت لنا اس بي اس اس. فقلنا انه بنورجيكم عليه عشان بس تكونوا فاميليا، يعني اذا نزل عليكم انكم تشتغلوا عليه عارفين ايش الكوماند رح يكون هناك، عارفين انه الانترفيس او الهيئه تبعت الاس بي اس اس، فما ما بتجيكم الرهبه. تعرفوا اول شيء لما نستخدم اي تكنولوجيا جديده او برنامج جديد بكون عندنا الرهبه زي التايهين ضايعين. فبتكون على القليله في مره سيد صالح حكى انه طب احنا كيف رح نتعلم هيك ما رح يزبط. لا، احنا كان فكره انه انتم تكونوا مهيئين له، عندكم فكره عنه عشان لما تنزلوا وتتعاملوا معه ما يكون عندكم الرهبه الاولى عن البرنامج. هذا اول شيء. اليوم ان شاء الله انا وكريس رح نحكي معاكم. هلا ايش هو الموضوع رح نحكي اليوم؟ التكمله هو اخر مرحله بالفود سكيورتي اناليسيز. احنا بلشنا اول شيء فهمنا شو هم الانديكيتورز، عرفنا شو هم، ليش بنحسبهم، كيف بنحسبهم. تعلمنا كيف بنعمل الكويشنير. تمام. على اي اساس نبني الكويشنير. ايش الاسئله نحطها بتكون لها علاقه بالمؤشرات. عرفت؟ فهاي خلصناها، بعدين عرفنا كيف نحسبها مانيولي عشان انتم تعرفوها، بعدين اعطيناكم كيف تقدروا تعملوها وتنزلوها على اس بي اس اس. اخر شيء لما تطلع عندك النتائج هون بصير عندك الريبورتنج. الريبورتنج كثير مهم. ليش الريبورتنج كثير مهم؟ لما انت بدك، انت عم تعمل بحث، عملت اشي عم بتقيم، مثلا خلينا نحكي انه بدنا نشوف اثر المساعدة على مجموعة معينة من الناس، واللي هو هذا رح نورجيكم اياه الريبورت هلا. انه الدبليو اف بي اردن كانوا عم بيعملوا في ناس ريفيجيز او انه لاجئين ما كانوا داخل او ما كانوا مسجلين وما كانوا داخل المساعدات. فعملوا برنامج انهم يدخلوهم بالمساعدات. فايش احنا عملنا بالاول؟ بدنا نشوف تاثير هاي المساعده على هدول اللاجئين او المستفيدين. فايش عملنا؟ اول شيء عملنا انه عملنا البيس لاين. بتعرفوا البيس لاين هو بس نشوف وضعهم قبل ما المساعدات. ليش؟ لانه ليش احنا بنعمل البيس لاين يا جماعه؟ عشان نقارن الوضع قبل وبعد. عرفتوا كيف؟ فدائما نعمل بيس لاين، بعدين بنعمل اند لاين هو بعد ما ياخذ المساعدات باشهر معينه بنعملها، بس بنشوف كيف الوضع اذا تحسن. طبعا ايش صار؟ احنا عندنا وقتها الكورونا بلشت، كان المفروض هذا ينعمل بشهر 4 2020. الاند لاين بحكي كالنهايه، لا بلشنا عملنا الاند لاين بشهر 11 ل 2020. ليش الكورونا اجلت كثير؟ الكورونا اثرت كمان على النتائج، ولكن برضه قدرنا مثلا على القليله نعرف انه المساعدات كان لها وقع او امباكت، تاثير احسن على المستفيدين، لانه قلنا لو ما اخذوا المساعدات راح تكون حالتهم اسوء بكثير. تمام. ف you want to share the report or do you have it right?
Yeah, I have it.
احنا هلا رح نمشي معاكم بالريبورت. اوكي، بدنا نصير يصير في ديسكشن اكثر، بصير احنا نحكي ديسكشن ليش عملنا هيك، سوينا هيك، وهذا الحكي. تمام. تمام، هذا هو الريبورت اللي عم نشوفه، بعرف اذا واضح عندكم.
واضح من عندي.
تمام. Thank you, Vian. Do you want to start with it and say how we can structure it or something like that?
Yeah, we can give a.
And we can go more into how we structure it at the beginning. Then we start with the results, with the work from the demographics, why we put the demographics so we can understand the community that we are.
Yeah, so thanks, Ahmed, and hi, everybody. So with the reporting, there's a few key sections. We're going to focus, I think, mostly on reporting the results, which we sort of developed over the past couple of days, how you can get from the data that you get, calculate it, and then move into looking at cross tabulations. And from cross tabulations, then once that analysis is done, then there's really reporting or communicating the results and what they mean. So I hope this will be helpful, both thinking about if you're doing a study yourself, but also, we regularly get these kind of results on coordination calls. I know, like in NES, often we get our colleagues at REACH do a lot of food security analysis in camps and stuff like that. And so you'll see how they communicate as well. It's good to see how different people do it and be aware of it. So this report is quite in depth and something that we would probably, this isn't sort of a average report, but it has a lot of the features so we can look at all of them. The structure of the report is basically, we'll often go through kind of our methodology, research questions. We don't list out the whole survey that we gave or anything like that, but we just give a sense of which indicators we wanted to gather and how we conducted the survey. Was it by phone? Was it in person? Was it, when did we do it? That kind of thing. We give a sense of how big the sample was. So if you're doing it in, like this one in Jordan was, I think 2,000 households, or no, sorry. This one was 600 or 700 households sampled at a baseline and an end line. Then we report the results of the study, including the demographic indicators that we discussed. And then we go into the indicators that we gathered. So you can see here all the ones that we've talked about. Not highlighted, sorry. Anyway, food consumption score, nutrition quality, dietary diversity, RCSI, LCSI. And we also, this is where cross tabulation comes in. We'll get more into it, but we report these for all of the groups that we are concerned about, by household head sex, by disability status, by household size, and other things. And then also we report the expenditure and debt. And then we go into a poverty analysis, which is a little bit beyond, but is based on the expenditure. Economic capacity to meet essential needs is sort of a technical term for poverty. And then after we've reported those results, we also had this in this one a targeting validation, which is another sort of is not totally related to what we were talking about. And then we go into discussion. And this is where in the results section, we really report the figures as we have produced them in our crosstabs, in just looking at the average of the descriptive statistics of the indicators. And then in the discussion, we go deeper and we start to build a story. And I say story not in the sense of something that's fiction or false or a children's story, but we want to build a narrative and have a sense of why we're seeing what we're seeing. We can't say exactly why, right? But we can start to connect the indicators in the discussion to have a really stronger idea of what is going on for the food security of the households that we surveyed, and maybe also the population that they represent. So yeah, I'll let Ahmed translate all that. Sorry.
هلا كبداية كلاسكا عم بحكي كيف إنه إحنا بنبني هذا الريبورت. هذا بحكي هذا الريبورت مش من الأشياء البيسك، يعني عادة إحنا بنعمل سمري، بس هذا لأنه كان دراسة كبيرة بدنا ندرس أثر المساعدة على الناس الجدد اللي انضموا للمساعدات، نشوف الأثر عليهم، فعملنا بيس لاين اند لاين. فهو هذا الريبورت كان أكثر، أو التقرير كان أكثر إنه عم بدخل بتفاصيل أكثر للناس، بتفاصيل أكثر عن وضعهم الأمن الغذائي، مش فقط إنه إحنا بس بنعمل ريبورت أو عم نعمل أبديت للسيتويشن، لا إحنا عم ندرس الحالة بشكل كامل. فدائما بنبلش مثلا بنحكي عن الباك جراوند أو خلفية الدراسة تبعتنا، بنحط الأهداف تبعتنا، أسئلة كلها بنحطهم، الأسئلة البحث تبعنا، إيش إحنا كان هدفنا من هذا البحث، إيش الأسئلة اللي لازم نجاوبها. بعدين بنحط الميثودولوجي أو الطريقة يعني إيش هم الانديكيتورز رح نحسبهم. طبعا ما بنحط هون إحنا التول يا إما بنحطها بالأنكس آخر شيء، أو إنه مش مضطرين نحط التول، بس بنحط إنه إيش هم المؤشرات اللي إحنا لازم نحسبها. عندك السامبل اللي هو اللي هي نشوف قديش الحجم. مثلا هون مثلا في عندنا كثير ستاتيفيكيشن، او انه مجموعات احنا عملها. في عندك ناس بيكونوا كثير extremely vulnerable، يعني هو حالتهم جدا سيئة، او vulnerable. And did we take the number of fisheries here, right? Or we didn't take the
Number of what?
It's only extremely vulnerable and vulnerables, right?
No non-beneficiaries here.
فبس اخذناهم لانه قسموا الاسر لاثنين، هم حالتهم جدا سيئه وحالتهم سيئه. فبنحط بناخذ شو اسمه فبنعرف العدد على كل مجموعة أخذناهم. بعدين بنروح على الريزلتس او النتائج. هون احنا بناخذ النتائج بشكل عام، او الداتا اللي ورجيناكم اياها امبارح. احنا وي ريبورت بس بنحط هاي النتائج موجوده، ان كانت بالديموغرافيكس او يعني كم كان رب الاسره ذكر، كم اعمارهم، كم ايش الاديوكيشن تبعهم او التعليم تبعهم. بعدين بنروح على الفود سكيورتي انديكيتورز. احنا هون بالريزلتس احنا عم نحط بس النتائج اللي طلعت معنا. كيف امبارح عندنا نطلع النتائج بالاس بي اس اس ونحطهم، بنحط النتائج ونشوف كيف التغييرات اللي صارت ونقارنها بين البيس لاين والاند لاين. تمام. وبندخل كل المؤشرات زي ما انتم شايفينها، مع النفقات ونسبه النفقات الغذاء على نسبه النفقات على نفقات الغذاء، النفقات الكليه. تمام. امتى احنا بنيجي بنحكي اكثر، انه نوضح اكثر ايش الريزلتس؟ لما نروح على الدسكشن. يعني عندك الدسكشن هذا او المناقشه، هون احنا بنصير نربط كل المؤشرات مع بعض لنوصل لايش؟ لشيء نستنتجه او قصه. يعني القصه طبعا ما بنكون احنا مخترعينها، لا طبعا ابدا. القصه هي بتكون مرتبطه مع الداتا اللي احنا عندنا. تمام، في اشياء بنكون كاتبينها، في اشياء يمكن بدها نتحرى عنها اكثر ونعرفها، لانه ما بنكون 100% عارفين، فبنقدر نعطي احتمالات انه ايش كان الاثر هاي المؤشرات على مؤشرات الامن الغذائي او الوضع العام الامن الغذائي، ايش كان الاسباب لها كانت. ف آه، بعديها عشان نعطي الاستنتاجات بهاي الدراسه، لما احنا عملنا ديسكشن مناقشات حطينا اشياء رح نورجيكم كيف صار الديسكشن، صرنا نربط المؤشرات مع بعض. بعديها عملنا شيء اسمه كواليتيتيف فولو اب. بعدنا عملنا ديسكشن عشان بس في اشياء معينه بدنا يكون لها شرح اكثر، نفهمها اكثر على الواقع، فاضطرينا نحكي مع الناس كم من حد، يمكن حكينا مع 50 واحد بس عشان نعرف نفهم الوضع بشكل عام. في اشياء كانت شوي مبهمه فعملنا لها هي زي ما انتم مثلا بالانكس حاطين اللي هو الكواليتيف فولو اب. اوكي، هاي كثير مرات بعد الكوانتيتيف، بعد ما يكون عندك هدف، في اشياء ما بتكون الرقم عطاك بس ايش ممكن يكون مثلا في له عده اسباب، فما لنا غير نضطر نرجع للكواليتيف فولو اب. ماشي، و نعطي كواليتيف فولو اب عشان نفهم هاي المؤشرات ايش كان سببها، ايش السبب وراء هاي الريزلتس او النتائج تبعتها. تمام. anything that you want to add to that Chris or good؟ هلا بدنا نبلش انه we're going to go directly to the results section right؟
Yeah.
اوكي، هلا رح نبلش بالريزلتس، رح نشرح لكم كيف احنا بنحط الريبورت، كيف بنقدمه. تمام، وانا رح اكون مع كريس على اي سؤال بدكم اياه، انا رح اكون هون to translate in Arabic.
Tamam. Okay, so the one thing I'll just highlight in the sample before we get into the results is that we have when you're reporting, you always want to say what population you're sampling, because this has this is a crucial piece of information to understand what population your results are representative for. If you sample only a certain population, if you sample only people living in camps, you can't say anything about people living outside of camps because you didn't have any information about them, right? So sampling is in itself, we could run a whole session on sampling. And if you guys have any questions about it, always feel free to reach out to us. But it's crucial just to think critically, think carefully about what population you actually got a sample from, and what population what that means for what the results that you're going to report mean. Yeah, Salahuddin, sorry, تفضل.
اوكي كويك نوت بس شكرا كريس. يا جماعه كريس عم بحكي عن سامبلينج، في عندنا كورس سامبلينج ان شاء الله حيكون التريننج في اخر شهر 6، فالكالندر اللي بعتنا عليها فيها موجوده سامبلينج للي حاب يعرف عن السامبلينج اكثر. حيكون يوم كامل مع one of our trainers شاطرين يعني expert in sampling. Okay, thank you Chris.
Tamam, yeah, thank you, Salah. So this is a whole, I just want to highlight it because it's just have it in your mind. What was the sample that will tell you what we can say about this population that we're talking about. Usually, we're not taking the food consumption score of everybody in a population. It'd take forever, and it would be very it would be very difficult, and very expensive. Yeah. So we get a sample, and then from there we draw conclusions about what's going on in the population as a whole. But yeah, we can. There's a whole session that we can do on sampling separately.
Do you want me to translate? Just let me know, okay?
Oh yeah. Kuchi Wade, or do you guys want a translation of that?
مرحبا.
Mute yours.
It's muted.
Okay.
اوكي بس على السريع بالنسبه للسامبل احنا ما بنقدر نروح على كل الناس ونسالهم عن الفود كونسومشن تاعهم او عن الامن الغذائي تاعهم. فاللي بنقدر نعمله انه احنا بننقي عينه ريبريزنتيف. ايش يعني ريبريزنتيف؟ يعني بتعكس معظم الناس، تمام؟ فما بنقدر مثلا نختار عينه بس من مجموعه واحده، تمام؟ اللي هو مثلا الناس اللي بس الأكثر احتياجاً أو الناس اللي وضعها ممتاز، أو لا، لازم تكون العينة مناسبة إنها تعكس البوبوليشن، يعني بتعكس المجموعات كاملة. فطبعاً عشان الوقت وعشان التكلفة بنحاول إنه ناخذ أكثر يعني العينة المناسبة. فما بيصير إنه لما نيجي نعمل ريبورت أو نحكي عن مجموعة معينة ما بيصير نقي بس مجموعة محددة ونحكي إنه هان تعكس كل البوبوليشن. فهاي هي فكرة السامبلينج بمختصر مفيد. وكيف ما حكى لكم صلاح إن شاء الله رح يكون في تريننج بشهر 6 للي حاب يعرف أكثر عن السامبلينج.
So yeah, one in this report we sampled only people who were WFP beneficiaries and only people who were involved in a particular program of UNHCR in Jordan. So there are refugees who live in communities. They had their legal status normalized and they became UNHCR, registered with UNHCR, and then they started receiving WFP assistance. We took a sample of these people. And we only sampled people, some of these households that had their status regularized, formalized with UNHCR, they didn't qualify as vulnerable to receive WFP assistance. Usually, we'll see, especially in Syria, for example, in a camp, the WFP or food security cluster will cover maybe an entire camp, right? So everybody's a beneficiary. But when it's not, when we're not looking just at a camp, usually we have some people who are beneficiaries, some people who aren't, based on the targeting criteria. And so in this case, we can't, even though these people are all refugees in communities in Jordan, we can't even say something about refugees living outside of camps in Jordan generally, because we just focused on this one group that was basically didn't have status with UNHCR before the study, and then they got status, and then they got WFP assistance. So in this report, we're not going to talk about just refugees in Jordan, Syrian refugees in Jordan. No, we're going to talk just about these cases who we were targeting to understand their situation. So maybe you guys should translate that because that's kind of.
هلا ليش كريس كان عم بحاول يحكي انه هدول الناس اللي احنا عملنا لهم تارجت هدول اخر شيء، خاصه اهم شيء انه لما احنا ناخذ السامبلين كل شيء احنا اخترنا ناس محددين، هدول ما رح يكونوا ريبريزنتيف لكل اللاجئين اللي يكونوا موجودين. ليش؟ لانه احنا اخترنا فقط ناس كانوا مش مشمولين ما كان لهم رقم مع اليو ان سي اتش ار او المفوضيه، مع انهم كان رقم مفوضيه، وبعدين نشملوا فيهم ونشملوا جوا المساعدات. فاحنا بس هدول الناس نقدر نساعدهم. نشوف بس ايش تاثير المساعده على وضعهم لهدول الناس. فاحنا ما بنقدر نعمم على الناس الثانيه، لان هم الكيس تبعتهم غير عن اي كيس ثانيه. عرفتوا كيف؟ دائما اذا بدك تعمم على مثلا خلينا نحكي لمجتمع معين او population معين، لازم يكون في على القليله عندك صفات معينه تكون برضه زي ما حكينا راندومايزيشن، يكون فيها يكون انه انت بتختار ناس عشوائيين بشكل عشوائي. لا بس هون بهاي الدراسه احنا في شيء بنسميه لونجيتيودينال، يعني هم نفس الناس اللي عملنا لهم بالبيس لاين نفسهم رجعنا قابلناهم بالاند لاين. تمام؟ فاحنا ما بدنا نعممها على حدا، احنا فقط عم نشوف تاثير المساعده على هدول الناس، وما بنقدر نعمم حالتهم هدول الناس على باقي اللاجئين. تمام؟
تمام، شكرا. So okay, now to the results. What did we find when we surveyed these people? So generally speaking, we will have the first thing we report is the demographics, because we want to understand what does this population look like, so that we can understand where we may need to do cross-tabulation to understand the different situation for people who are in different categories. So in demographics, we report on the sex of the household head, which is always a category that we cross-tabulate with. We report on the age of the household head by groups of age, so younger than 35, 35 to 44, 45 to 54, and 55 plus. The groups of age may be different depending on your population, but you may have a 55 to 64 and then a 65 plus as well. Depends on sort of what the makeup is. And then we have done it by governorate. Again, this is because it's a study across all of Jordan. If it's just a camp or something, or if you're doing multiple camps, maybe you want to have how many people were in each camp, or what the percentage of the sample was in each camp. We have education level here. As you can see here, primary school is the predominant one. We can also see that male-headed households are 76% of the population. Typically, the households are headed by people who are either young or in sort of early middle age. Then we also look at the employment status, how many people are employed and unemployed. Disability status, how many people are disabled, or how many households have at least one member that has some disability. Marital status, so married, single, widowed. Typically in this population, in this sample, people were married. The presence of chronic diseases. So in this population, actually a majority of the population had at least one person in the household who had some chronic disease. And then the type of residence. So when we're looking at community survey, we usually take this question. When we're looking at a camp, it's a little bit different, but in this scenario, most people were renting their housing.
كريس هون ببلش هون عم بيحكي انه نحكي عن الديموغرافيه تبعت الدراسه او الناس اللي احنا قابلناهم. زي ما بنشوف هدول الاشياء المؤشرات اللي احنا عم نورجيهم، زي جنس رب الاسره، عمر رب الاسره، المستوى التعليم لرب الاسره، اذا رب الاسره مشتغل او لا، اذا في هذا البيت فيه حدا عنده اعاقه معينه او لا، او انه احتياجات خاصه، اذا حدا من افراد العائله عندهم مرض مزمن. نشوف الحاله الزوجيه، مثلا هو مطلق، مطلقه، ارمله، ارمل، لحاله عايش سنجل او انه متزوج. برضه بنسال على الهاوس تايب اوف ريزيدنت اللي هو نوع السكن اللي هو عايش فيه. طبعا بقول لك اذا كان بالكامبس تبع، احنا ما بنسال الهاوس تايب اوف ريزيدنت لانه هم بالكامبس اوريدي موفرين لهم الكرفانات. بس انا بدي اسال سؤال، افتح فور اسمو ديسكشن، نعمل تيزر للبرين تبعنا، تمام؟ بس هيك ننكش شوي عشان نصحصح. بدي اسال، هلا انا بس بدي ارمي هذا السؤال، ليش فكركم نسال قديش عدد الناس اللي قابلناهم عايشين، ايش التايب اوف ريزيدنت او ايش هو نوع المسكن اللي هو عندهم؟ ليش؟ وليش كثير مرات بنحب انه برضه نعمل كروس تاب، اوكي، زي ما ورجيت لكم امبارح بالمؤشرات الامن الغذائي مع هدول الاسر حسب نوع المسكن تبعهم. ليش يا جماعه؟ هي نشوف ليش ما بنعملها هيك؟ ايش الفرق؟ يعني هل انت شفتوا هاي الريبورتنج هدول اول شيء هيك هذا السمري، بس ليش عم نسال على مثلا الهاوسولد هيد بيرتسد انه الحاله الزوجيه تبعته، او نوع المسكن تبعه، او اذا في حدا عنده مرض مزمن او لا، او الحاله الوظيفيه تبعته؟ شو رايكم يا جماعه؟ اذا بدكم تشاركوا مرحبا قبل ما تشاركوا. صحوا معي يا جماعه. الو. طيب خليني انا انقي، والله ما ينفعش الا هيك لما انقي انا. طيب سيد عماد معنا؟ سيد عماد. طيب سيد عماد شكله مش معنا. طيب نشوف مثلا شيرين.
صباح الخير استاذ. صباح الخير
صباح
جميل.
النور. طب هاي، طب بالله عليك ليش ما كنتوا تجاوبوا؟ هاي عشان ناديت اسمك يا شيرين جاوبتي. طب قبل ليش ما جاوبتوا انتوا؟ مغلبيني هالمره انتوا. طيب ليش بنسال هاي الاسئله؟ انه ليش قاعدين نعرضها؟
هلا استاذ عم نسال انه عن المرض المزمن، لانه هاي الامراض تاثر على استهلاك الغذاء والتنوع الغذائي.
تمام.
بالنسبه لل الاجار.
نعم.
كمان بيأثر على لما بنحسب المصاريف غير الغذائيه.
نعم.
ايه، فيعني انه
طب
هاي بتصير انه مثل اثبات للنتائج اللي بنحصل عليها.
في هيك احنا مرات كثير شفتوا امبارح لما عملنا كروس تاب بين المؤشرات الامن الغذائي ومؤشرات ثانيه او متغيرات ثانيه. هاي من المتغيرات، طب انت عم تحكي 91% مستاجرين، شو يعني يا جماعه 91% عندنا مستاجرين؟ كيف راح يكون وضعهم تقريبا؟
هلا هدول يعني رح يصرفوا كمية كبيرة على من الانكم على الدخل،
على اجار. هلا فكرك ممكن يبدوا او يحطوا بريوريتي للرنت على الاكل؟
ايه ممكن.
صح؟
إيه
انه
صح.
يقلل الاكل، وهذا بياثر على ايش؟ وضح من الامن الغذائي، صح؟
ايوه مزبوط.
طيب سؤال ثاني، ايش الحاله الزوجيه بتهمنا؟ بايش بتهمنا؟
هلا اذا مثلا مرأة مطلقة او ارملة، فهاي كمان بيأثر انه المرأة ممكن يكون يعني تواجه صعوبة بالوصول إلى السوق، يعني حسب الوضع الاجتماعي للمنطقة.
نعم.
إيه.
يعني مثلا احنا بنقدر نعمل انه كروس تاب، مثلا نحط الفود كونسومشن سكور، ماشي، نعمله باي الهاوس هولد هيد سكس او انه الجنس رب الاسره مع حالته الزوجيه. ف بصير احنا عندنا زي 4 كاتيجوريز 6 كاتيجوريز اللي هم 4 للحالات الحاله الزوجيه مع انه اذا كان ذكر و4 مع اذا كانت انثى. فبصير عندك تقريبا زي عندنا 8 بيكون ريزلتس. هون بصير يورجيك انت مين اكثر وحده مستضعفه فيهم، ليش الفود كونسبشن سكور تبعتهم بتكون ضعيفه. مثلا ممكن يطلع لنا اذا كانت ارمله ومراه كانت جنسهم الاسره انثى ورجال انه هم حالتهم الغذائيه اقل من غيرهم، في بصير نعطي مثلا نربطها بالمين بيلرز اللي حكيناهم اللي هم انه والله ما بتقدر تروح على السوق، ما في حدا يجيب لها الاغراض، صعب تلاقي شغل، عرفت كيف؟
مظبوط.
فكل هاي الاشياء بتفيدنا. فاحنا دائما هدول الديموغرافيكس بنحطهم شيء اساسي. ليه؟ عشان نعمل كروس تاب. فلازم نعمل سمري لهم اول شيء، وبعديها نعمل كروس تاب معهم مع الفود سكيورتي انديكيتورز عشان ايش؟ نفهم اكثر القصه. تمام؟ شكرا كثير يا شيرين. مين حابب يضيف شيء ثاني هون؟ غير شيرين شكرا. وفي عندنا على الشات زحمان said انه because it shows the vulnerability level. Exactly. برضه it could give us some vulnerability of the people, especially in the employment status. Okay. Maybe خلينا نحكي household type of residence. It shows also the vulnerability level of the people. فيس sure. وكنا عم نناقش اكثر كمان انه ليش بيفيدونا لما نعمل كروس تاب مع الفود سكيورتي انديكيتورز. طيب في حدا حابب يضيف شيء ثاني؟ شو يا جماعه؟ بس هيك شيرين بدها تشارك. وطلال انت you are familiar with this يا طلال، حابب تضيف شيء؟ سيد طلال معنا؟ تمام اوكي. طيب فهون اول شيء بنبلش بالديموغرافيكس. هلا كريس رح يكمل معنا. We're gonna continue now.
تمام. So one thing that we did not cover in this table that would usually be part of this table, we can call it figure 1 or table 1 usually in surveys like this, is the household size. And the reason that we separated the household size and then we made a whole table for it is because in this survey, we have a baseline and an end line. We collected data in September, October of 2019. And then you're supposed to collect data in March of 2020. Of course, it didn't happen. So we collected in September of 2020. In between those two periods, the household size in the sampled households, again, not the population, but enough households that we could maybe think about it as representative, went from 4.7 people in a household on average to 6.3 on average. Actually, the number of people in the sample, I don't know where it's observed household size growth. It went from about 4,000 people in the, it went from about 3,000 people in the sample in 2019 when we surveyed them at the baseline. And at the end, we had 4,050. So the reason we separated it out and then we looked at the categories, which is a binned group where small households have 1 to 3 people, medium households have 4 to 6, large households have 7 plus. Actually, in this survey, the largest household was 25 people. We looked at the number of new children. So we looked at the difference between the number of children in the household at the baseline and the end line. Some households added up to 12 children, but most added 1 or 2. And we took the average children, we took the average non-dependents, so people who are working age and who are adults and who are also not above 60, I think is the cutoff we had. And then we looked at the size by the governorate and also the number of children by the governorate. So this is because we saw growth, which is not typical. I mean, adding 1,000 people to a survey population over a course of a year is difficult. Also, we did this longitudinally, so we had the same households at the baseline and the end line. So we can be sure that the growth we're seeing is not just because we happened to sample big households in one year and small households in the other year. So we can report on these things. So we did this separately, but this is another thing that we do. And often we do a crosstab by the size category because household size in this sample ranged from 1 to 25. So doing a cross tabulation for every number of a household size is crazy. We break it into these categories, then we have some sense of what we're doing, of how the household size is affecting food consumption, coping strategies, all that, without having to do it by each household member added. And so I'll let Ahmed translate that and also ask a couple of questions. One is why do we report this change in the household size category? Why is this important for when we're going to do our cross tabulations later? And the second one is, why were we looking at the number of new children or the change or the difference in the number of children in a household for between the baseline and the end line?
نعم. هون كريس عم بقول لكم احنا دائما بنحط حجم الاسره مع الديموغرافيكس او المعلومات الاساسيه عن الاسره بالفكر الاولاني، ولكن بهاي الدراسه صادفتنا شيء انه احنا بسنه، يعني لما عملنا البيس لاين ب 2019 بعدين عملنا الاند لاين ب 2020 اخر 2020 انتبهنا انه عدد افراد الاسره زاد بطريقه كثير كبيره، يعني كان من 3000 ل 4000 العدد اللي احنا قبلناهم، واحنا عم نحكي انه احنا نفس العائلات نفس الاسر اللي قابلناهم بالبيس لاين قابلناهم بالاند لاين، تمام؟ ولكن العدد زاد بطريقه كثير كبيره، يعني حتى لو بتشوفوا مثلا هون شوفوا بالبيس لاين للاند لاين كان البيس لاين الافريج نمبر اوف بيبل او الممبرز او الاعضاء الاسره 4.7، بالاند لاين صار 6.3، يعني تقريبا زاد كل عيله بالمتوسط زادت شخصين، عرفتوا كيف؟ وانت عم تحكي عن سنه، تمام؟ هلا انت شوف كيف الهاوس سايز كاتيجوري او انه حجم الاسره، فئات حجم الاسره مثلا احنا عاملينهم مقسمينهم لسمول ميديوم لارج، حاطين عدد الافراد على كل وحده. شوف كيف السمول كان عددها بالبيس لاين كان عددها 35%، كانت من هلا صاروا 14% من السامبل. عندك الميديم ما تغيرت كثير، شوف اللارج كيف زادت من 24 ل 43% من السامبل. فعم نحكي انه لا الاسر عم تتغير، عم نشوف حتى شفنا كيف العدد الاطفال كيف زادوا، قديش عدد على القليله عندك زاد طفل واحد، يعني نحكي عن انه 143 اسره حطت انه طفل زاد عندها واغلبيتهم طفل او طفلين. عم نشوف كيف عدد الاطفال زاد، طبعا الاطفال بنحكي احنا اقل من 18 سنه. ف نعم التي تيست اذا كان significant، تمام؟ بس احنا هون احنا وي ار ريبورتنج. خلينا بس اشوف الشات، انا لانه انا اسف اشوف الشات. نعم إذا بدنا نشوف إذا في عندك significant, it was significant at that time, right? Change.
The change was significant. Yeah, you'll see we're doing
أيوة.
physical testing to see if the change is significant. Yes, P less than highly significant. And we also see that the one thing that we did is we also looked at the size of households by, we did a crosstab with the male or female headed household had sex, saw that male households tended to be larger at the end than female households as well.
اكيد عملنا تيست زي ما ورجيناكم وكانت significant. احنا دائما نشوف التغيير اذا كان significant او انه في كان تغيير او لا من التي تيست، بس هون احنا برضه عم نورجيكم الارقام. ارقام كيف زادت، انه احنا عندنا زادت، بس نتاكد اذا كانت الزياده يعني ملحوظه significant نحكيها، بنعمل تي تيست زي ما انت حكيت يا علي. فاخر شيء انه حكى كريس عم بيسال سؤال بيحكي ليش فكركم زاد عدد الاعضاء بالاسره بهي الطريقه، وليش احنا عم نطلع على اعداد الاطفال اللي هم الاقل من 18؟ اوكي، وليش انه زادوا عندهم كثير؟ This is the last two questions that you asked. Why do you think that the number of members of the household increased this insignificant amount, and why we also look for the number of children that is increased, or in general the number of children in a household, right?
Yeah, first is why would we report, why do we report this change in household size? Like, why is this change in the categories? So the small got much smaller, the medium stayed the same about, and then large got much bigger. Why is that important for when we're looking at our crosstabs about household size? Yeah, and then the other one, yeah, like why not just report this average children growth, right? We added about 1 child per household on average.
Yes.
So why do this chart here?
Yes. هو بيحكي انه هون احنا كثير مهم نسال ليش احنا بنحط الهاوسهولد سايز كاتيجوريز او الحجم الاسره، وليش مهم انه بنعمل الكروس تاب، ليش ناخذها بعين الاعتبار. ثاني شيء انه احنا عم نحط انه الاعداد زادت للاطفال هم اقل 18 سنه تقريبا بالافرج 1، او ليش احنا بنحط الفكره اللي جنبها اللي هي number of new children added at end line، ليش احنا بنحط هاي الاشياء، ليش بنعملها كلها؟ شو رايكم يا جماعه؟ يلا شاركونا. مين حابب يشاركنا؟ يعني اذا حكيت بالاسم رح تشاركوا، اذا ما حكيت بالاسم يا عمار رح تشاركوا. يلا يا جماعه، مين حابب يشارك هون؟ ها اخيرا، ها والله كنت حاسس بيان رح ترفع يدك. تفضل يا بيان. يس
ثانك يو احمد. هلا بالنسبه لهي التفاصيل بظن انها مهمه لنعرف حسب كل عائله، يعني بيختلف الوضع، انه مثلا اذا كان الهيد اوف هاوس هولد انه كان رب الاسره، مثلا اذا كانت امراه او كان رجل، يعني بيعطي هذا مؤشر ثاني عن وضع الاسره بشكل عام وعن النتائج اللي نحن اخذناها. مثلا حتى ممكن نستفيد منها بغير مجالات، مثلا انه نعرف نسب الأسر يلي بتكون رب الأسرة فيها امرأة أو بيكون رب الأسرة فيها طفل، وكمان عن عدد أفراد الأسرة أو عدد أفراد العائلة. هذا كمان بيساعدنا إنه نعرف مثلا ليش أخذنا ليش كان عندنا هذا الرقم، أو شو نسبة الأسر يلي عددها مثلا أقل من 5 أو أكثر من 5 أو شخصين أو مثلا شخص واحد هيك.
اكيد معك، اكيد كل ما زادت عدد الاسره بدك تشوفي كيف بتاثر الوضع الغذائي تبعهم. مش saying like number is going to increase, the number is going to affect food security indicators and the food security situation of the whole family, and especially also for children. We know that children that are dependent, they need more caring on that. But I want to add also a question. Why do you think, okay, the number of households increased suddenly? It's like a teaser for the brain. And in 1 year, why do you think that the number of the household member increased significantly in 1 year and with a big amount? Okay. يعني انا عم بحكي ليش يا جماعه. هلا فينا حكت الاسباب وكلها متعلقه، بس بدي اسال ليش زاد عدد افراد الاسره بطريقه كثير كبيره فقط بالسنه؟ ايش في الاسباب اللي ممكن ادت انها تزيد عدد افراد الاسره؟ شو رايكم يا جماعه؟ ليش عدد الاسره هيك زاد؟ اعطونا، يعني احنا عندنا نحلل كثير انه ليش زاد، وتوصلنا لاشياء كثير انه وصلنا رح نقول لكم اياها بالاخير، يعني عرفتوا كيف؟ بس ليش فكركم زاد؟ يعني هذا بتشوفوه اخر شيء بالدسكشن لما نحكي عنه. بس قبل ما نوصل للدسكشن، انتوا اعطوني رايكم ليش عدد الاسره الواحده زاد كثير؟ يعني عم تحكي عن 1000. شو يا جماعه؟ فيان انت رافع ايدك من قبل ولا هلا رفعت ايدك؟ والله عم تحبطوني يا جماعه عن جد، يعني اكثر من واحد عم بترجاكم انكم تشاركوا.
لا هاي رفعة جديدة. هلا بالنسبة انه ليش زاد، ممكن خلال السنة الماضية مثلا بسبب الكورونا انه كانت الأسرة أكثر بالبيت مثلا، أو ممكن إنه هن شافوا إنه زيادة عدد أفراد الأسرة بيؤدي إلى زيادة المساعدة اللي رح تكون مقدمة لهم.
Okay, that's a good one. برضو Vian, thank you for that so much. برضو Ziman, I'm not sure, but maybe because families with bigger number gets more assistance, so the families took that as an opportunity to get assistance. This is a very good point, actually. You almost hit the point, almost. Okay, and there's of course, there's other reasons, yes, for sure, but this is one of the major reasons. This is amazing, actually, for both of you, Vian and Himan. And also, Suad wanted to add something. Suad, you wanted to add something?
Yes, good morning.
Yes.
Sure, you are asking about the reason, right? So maybe one of the reason is the increase in the household size is the newborns. So an addition of children to the families. So larger size. As well, as mentioned by Dian, it's related to we can say the current economic situation, which is related to pandemic, that more families are living together.
Yes. This is like you hit the points, actually.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, Chris, if you want to have comments on that.
Yeah. So no, it's great. So what Suad and Vian, and also these are all reasons, actually. So each of these answers is correct somewhat. So if we were looking just at the average number of children in the household, we would say, okay, the average household increased by about 1. So by 1 child, that's consistent. We're looking at a 1-year period. So it makes sense. People have kids, and maybe everybody, like a lot of people had a kid, basically, 1 kid. We look at the new children added to verify this. When we look deeper, we see that there's 650 households about in the sample. About half of them did not add any children. So where is this increase of 1 per household coming from? Well, many households, 143 plus 58. So basically, this is 200 households added 1 or 2 kids. So we can think, okay, maybe you added 1 kid, adding 1 or 2 kids. You could conceive of that as new births into the family. But then several households, I mean, a not insignificant number added 3, 4, 5, 6 kids. If we think about, I don't think that we're seeing 26 households having triplets. So really we have now to consider what Suad was saying, which is in the economic situation, many households are now moving in together to consolidate for rent purposes. So this is part of, and this is important because if we just looked at the average, we would tell one story, which is, looks like probably a lot of people had kids in this population. Maybe some had 0, some had 1, some had 2, and we get about this number. But when we look at this, and I mean, 12 is a big example. This household actually went from 2 people to 25 people. They added 12 kids and 11 adults. This is definitely not just people being born. This is households joining together. Also, with this population, because their status was regularized and they became formally part of the UNHCR system, we thought maybe that some households are bringing members who were living in a camp or living elsewhere who were not living in the household when it was surveyed before at the baseline, at the very soon after they were regularized. But once they started receiving WFP assistance, they brought their family members. And then that's where also Ziman's comment comes in. Bigger households, so families in this population get assistance by the per capita. So the more people in the household, the more receiving assistance. We don't want to, this is an important point here as well. We don't want to stigmatize the households. Oh, they're greedy, they just want assistance. If we're thinking about this argument, we think about it in terms of them using a coping strategy to survive. And if we think about the pandemic, especially, a lot of people we saw didn't have any other income besides what they got from WFP, because in Jordan, the lockdowns closed almost all the economic activity. And so we don't want to just say, oh, these households did this so that they could get more money. We have to, when we communicate, we want to be nuanced and tell a story that is also upholding the dignity of the households and making sure that they're not seen as greedy or something like that, because we know that it's not true. They're doing what they need to do to survive. But so all of these things are important, but we have to be realistic also and say, why would people pursue a certain strategy? This will tell us something about their vulnerability, tell us something about why, when we look at the food consumption score, the coping strategies, the expenditure, why we see what we see. So this is, it's always important to do this. And it's also important to remember that what goes in these tables is, at the end of the day, the decision of the person who's doing the study. And if you see something and you think, wow, this is pretty interesting, it's usually helpful to dig a little deeper, because with average number of children, remember, you can tell a story about new births, but with the number of children added, then we can tell a story now about new births, but also about household reunifications or people living together to save rent money. So it's up to your curiosity really to dig as deep as you want to dig and start to really explain the situation of people in a holistic way.
بس بالمختصر شو كريس حكى، احنا لما طلعنا على الاسماء، لو احنا اخذنا بس الافرج او متوسط انه الزياده بالاطفال، احنا بنطلع على واحد، يعني هو ممكن العيله يمكن ما زادت ولا شيء، يمكن زادت 1 2، يعني بالافرج 1 2. بس لما فتنا اكثر، هذا شيء طبيعي يعني بسنه انه يزيد 1 2 مثلا بالبيت. بس لما احنا فتنا الاغلبيه تحكي عن تقريبا 200 واحد زادوا 1 2. بس لما نطلع انه مثلا بيت 26 واحد 26 أسرة، تمام. بقول لك إنه زادوا 3. هلا ممكن بيت يجيهم تريبلت أو إنه 3 يخل إنه تكون توأم إنه تكون حامل ب3 بس. 26 أسرة هي كثيرة. طب اطلع أنت شوف، عندك 17 واحد حكوا 4 زادوا أطفال، عندك 15 حكوا 5 زادوا، عندك واحد حكى 12 طفل. فهذا زي ما حكى انه آه الزياده ما راح تكون انه بالخلفه، انه ما راح تكون عشان اسيستنت، قصدي السعاد لما حكت. هذا بدل انه عشان البانديميك اللي صار والكورونا اللي صارت عيال ايش تصير تتجمع بعض، تسكن مع بعض. كمان ما تنسوا اربطوها بالاجار. انتوا عم تحكوا 91% من البنفيشريز اللي حكينا معهم او الريسبوندنتس، اوكي، 91% على الاجار عايشين. فانت متخيل مع تسكير البلد وبطلوا بيعتمدوا على الدبليو اف بي اسيستنت، تمام، وما في شغل. طب لا، بيحكوا لا نعيش كلنا مع بعض، بزيد المصاري معنا بالبيت وبندفع اجر واحد. عرفتوا كيف؟ فهاي هي كانت من الاسباب اللي عم نحكيها.
Okay, so that's this is the demographics, and I hope it's this is when people think of food security, you think food consumption score, coping strategies, and this is very important. But I hope it's sort of clear that when we think about the how to interpret things, the demographics is actually very, very important. And also we'll see that the crosstabs for the indicators are crucial as well. So we will move now to the indicators, or should we take a break, or no? We can
take a break for 10 minutes, let them rest, and then until the end we can go. So everything can be related. We don't stop in the middle of the food security.
Cool.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's take a break, and then we'll come back at
12:40. 11:40.
11:40. Yeah.
خلينا نرجع يا جماعة، ناخذ بريك هلا، نرجع على الساعة 11:40. بس بدي اياكم تكونوا بتشاركوا أكثر، تمام؟ خلاص إن شاء الله على 11:40 بنرجع إحنا نتواصل ونرجع التمرين. اوكي لا
Hello, everybody. Welcome back. Let us know you're back just in the chat, and then we'll get started.
بس رجعوا يكتبوا لنا على الشات انه موجودين معنا عشان نبلش. Tomorrow's back. صالح and tomorrow's back. Tomorrow's back. Okay.
Okay, we have a few. Anybody else?
عادي رجعت. شيرين هون. اوكي. كمان شو يا جماعة؟ مين ضايع أصلا؟ مش حدا كثير ضايع. عماد.
Any other people? Suad and
عماد سعاد وفيان. Are you back guys? يلا. تمام.
Yalla. So, okay, so we're picking up with reporting the food security indicators. And so we started with food consumption score. You'll see here in our report we're giving t-tests, or tests of statistical significance to show difference between the baseline and the end line. This is something that we can do when we're looking at 2 time periods. But the main thing is we start with the average for the entire population, and we see actually that the average improved from the baseline to the end line. We went from 54 to 59. So before at the baseline, 54 is a good, it's an acceptable food consumption score on average. And we moved to the end line. And then we divided into groups. As we were saying in the last training, when you see the average, you see 54, you can't just assume that means that, well, on average, everybody's okay. We want to look and see, are there people that fall into the borderline or the poor category? So below 42 here, borderline below 28 for poor here in our region. So we see that 6% are in the poor category and 27% are in the borderline category. So this average of 54 doesn't mean that everybody's doing great. About 33, about a third of households are actually either borderline or poor. By the end line, we see that the situation improves. Both the average improved, but also 10% more households, or sorry, not 10%, but 10% of households have now, we added 10 percentage points to the number of households who are in the acceptable category. So this is a pretty strong gain. It's important to remember that this does not mean that the same households so 66% are acceptable, and now 76%. So we have the same 66, and then 10% of households moved up. And they moved up from these borderline or poor categories. Now we have 25% of the population that's in these categories. When we look at a longitudinal study like this, where we take the same households at 2 time points, we see often, this is skipping ahead and not something that you normally do. Where is it? This is size category. So when we have a longitudinal data set, meaning we have the same households at 2 time points, and only when we have that, we can see the movement. And actually, we see that 10% of households starting at the baseline being in the acceptable category move to the borderline, 2% move to poor, while 6% that were in poor, 2/3 of those, 4% of the population, became acceptable by the end line, and 2% became borderline. They improved their situation, some more than others. And we see that those who are in the borderline category, majority of them moved into acceptable, and only 9% of the households, or about about a third of the households who started off in the borderline category at the baseline were in the borderline category at the end line. So that's one thing to know when you're looking across, and when you don't have longitudinal data, this is obvious. You don't have the same households, but when you have longitudinal data, you might even have, even though you surveyed the same households, it's important to remember that this does not mean that it's not so simple as to say that the food consumption, that people stayed good, or we're talking about the population and not just about the situation of individual households may be different within these bars. But at least this allows us to say, in the population, we can see how many people, what percentage of people at a certain time point are doing well, and those who are not doing quite as well. I don't know, yeah, we should probably.
هون كريس عم بيحكي على الفود كونسومشن سكور، احنا بناخذها على اوفر اول، يعني بشكل عام احنا شفنا الافرج كيف زاد من بيس لاين ل 54 59، الاثنين كانوا اكسبتبل بس السكور زاد اكثر. فزي ما حكينا الافرج لحاله ما بيقدر يورجينا، هلا دائما احنا الافرج بنورجينا عشان نشوف كومباريزن بين يعني فترتين معينين، فهي بتورجينا اذا زاد او قل، بس ما بيقدر يورجينا انه ما بنقدر نحكم انه والله كل الاسر انه هم اكسبتبل، لانه لو شفنا على البيس لاين هم اكسبتبل 54، يعني الافرج يعني اكسبتبل، بس هون يبين انه عندنا 66% بس فقط بالاكسبتبل، وايل انه ثلثهم اللي هم 27% و6% موجودين بوردر لاين وبور. صار في تحسن بالاند لاين، شايفين افرج زاد، يعني عم بقول لك انه 10% من الاسر زادوا صاروا بالاكسبتبل مقارنه مع قبل، وقل العدد البوردر لاين والبور. هلا سنس احنا بنحكي على لونجيتيودينال، يعني لونجيتيودينال يعني هم نفس الهاوس هولدز، نفس الاسر بالبيس لاين والاند لاين، ما بنقدر نحكي والله انه هدول 66% كانوا بالبيس لاين نفسهم صاروا بالاند لاين ضلهم اكسبتبل. فاحنا عملنا هذا الجراف الاخيره بنورجي تحركات الهاوس هولد من البيس لاين للاند لاين، يعني احنا بنقدر نشوف كيف التحركات صارت. طبعا اذا ما كانت لونجيتيودينال، اذا ما كانت سيم هاوس هولد، ما بنقدر نعمل هاي الجراف. ف يعني فانتم زي ما انتم شايفين هون 66% بالبيس لاين كانوا اكسبتبل، صاروا 76، بس فقط 54% من 66% ضلهم اكسبتبل، وعندك 10% من هدول 66 لا تراجعوا صاروا بالبوردر لاين، و2% صاروا بور. هلا طب كيف صاروا 76%؟ لا، لانه عندنا 17% من اللي كانوا بوردر لاين بالبيس لاين صاروا اكسبتبل، وعندك 4% من البور تحسن وضعهم. فانتم شايفين احنا بنقدر نتبع الناس اللي صارت وضعهم سيء، تمام، انه الهاوس هولد انه قديش نسبتهم اللي تراجعت الفود كونسمشن سكور تبعتهم، او قديش نسبه الهاوس هولد اللي تحسنت نسبتهم. يعني زي ما انتم شايفين اكسبتبل، بس اللي كانوا اكسبتبل وضلوا اكسبتبل 54%، مع انه كانوا من 66%. تمام. بعدين نحكي بس 10%، يعني خلينا نحكي 12% تراجع من الاكسبتبل. تمام. فهاي هي كيف احنا بنوجه، هذا بس بنعملها فقط بالامبليتيودنال لما احنا بناخذ نفس الهاوس هولدز. تمام.
So next we'll go, when we report the food consumption score, then we will disaggregate it. Usually the two categories that are most often we do disaggregation or cross-tabbing by are household head sex and disability status. So in order to have a like question for you guys to chew on a bit, want to know, so when we look here now at the food consumption score by household head sex, what can we understand from it, or what or do we see a big difference between male and female headed households?
عم بقول لكم كريس انه احنا عملنا الافريج فود كونسومشن سكور، عملناها كروس تاب او ديساجريجيتد باي الهاوس هولد سكس، او انه جنس رب الاسره. شايفين في اختلاف بيناتهم، او انه شو رايكم بهاي الجراف؟ فيا ريت تشاركونا. سعاد از تايبينج. اذا حدا ثاني بده يحكي كمان. علي طلال ما حكيتوا اليوم. طلال معنا؟ خلينا نشوف مين. سعاد، تفضل سعاد. go ahead.
Okay, so if we are looking at the different figures, we are no major differences between the male or female headed household, related to the food consumption score. I would say this is what I can. So I would say it's not major differences. We are comparing. Yeah.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Okay, if we're comparing for both male and female, it's like at the baseline level or at the end line, it's not a huge or major differences in the numbers, as well in the percentage for the different classification as well. A minor differences in the percentages.
Yeah, we can say basically, and we can look at these two graphs together and say, okay, the average FCS of the whole population, we went from 54 to 59. For males, maybe they started at 53, so 1 point lower than females on average. And they ended at 59, which is the population average. And then 2 points above where the female-headed households ended. Now, in order to say whether they're different or not, especially when you see such small difference, we do a statistical test. And in this case, we found that there's no statistical significance. So we cannot say with certainty that the small differences that we observed are actual differences. And we see that they're basically the same. It's still sometimes worth reporting on the fact that we see a certain trend or a slight difference. It appears that female-headed households started off slightly better and ended up slightly worse. But also here we see that female-headed households in the poor category were 7% before at the baseline and 3% at the end line, whereas male-headed households had 6% and 4%. So this is a mirror image where female-headed households tended to be a little bit more likely to be in the poor category at the baseline. At the end line, they were a little bit less. But also the borderline category is larger here than it is here. And so we see that there's 4 percentage points difference between female-headed households in the acceptable category than the male-headed households in the same category at the end line. So in all of these analyses, we can report this trend. The difference is not statistically significant means that we can't be sure that if we took the food consumption score of every single household in the population, that we would see a real difference in between male and female-headed households. But there's some maybe slight differences here and there. So yeah, exactly. It's very similar. There's a few trends that are different a bit, but more or less also they're very close to what happened in the population, where the average score went up, the percentage of households in poor went down, percentage of households in acceptable went up. So yeah, we're seeing it's generally the same as the population.
علي saying إذا كان لا يوجد فرق معنوي للذكور بين بيس لاين وإند لاين، هل هناك داعي لتقسيم المجالات وإعطاء قرار بهالحالة؟ هي أقول لك شغلة علي، إحنا لأنه it's not only for the food consumption score، هي مش بس فقط للفود consumption score بنعمل بين الذكور والإناث. فدائما نحط التقسيم، إحنا دائما نورجي هذا التقسيم لأنه هو كتير مهم بالنسبة عشان إذا الناس بدها تعطي مساعدات للإناث أو لربات المنزل اللي هم إناث أو ذكور. تمام. وإحنا دائما نعرف الإناث هم المستضعفات بيكونوا إذا كانوا رب الأسرة. فمرة يعني صار إنه دائما نعمل aggregation للهاوسهولد 6 كتير مهم نورجي، حتى نورجي إنه مرات ممكن يكون في عندك فرق معنوي، ممكن ما يكون فرق معنوي. لما ما يكون في فرق معنوي احنا نعرف انه يعني يمكن حالات الاسر عم تتحسن بشكل عام، ان كان ذكر ولا كان انثى، فاحنا ما علينا نركز على اي حدا. بس ممكن بعدين هلا عندك مؤشرات ثانيه، احنا مش بس عندنا الفود كونسمشن سكور نقسمه على الذكور والاناث، عندنا مؤشرات ثانيه يمكن يكون significant اكثر بالمؤشرات الجاي. عرفت علي؟ تمام. Okay.
Tamam. We also will do it with the disability status, and in this case, there was not a statistically significant difference, but we see that the households with disability actually, while they're sort of lower at both end time points, the difference isn't significant, but it looks like they caught up a little bit with the households that are having no disability, especially when we look at the groups. Here is less than 60%, is 68%, and so these guys gain 13 percentage points here. This group only gains 9 in the acceptable, and the share that are in borderline or poor decrease, so that it looks, this is 28%, this is 23%. These populations look more similar at the end line. So worth reporting, it's not very, very different, and it's something that it's important to report it because we want to check if households who are affected by disabilities or households who are headed by females we want to make sure that there's not some dramatic difference happening. And so we report it to say, okay, this is generally the same situation, possibly a bit worse maybe for households with disability, but the statistical significance was not there to say for sure these households are doing much worse at either time point. Then we can move into food consumption score nutrition. And we'll just kind of go over these quickly. The FCSN we break into protein, vitamin A, and heme iron. As you guys know, we saw an increase in protein consumption, an increase in vitamin A consumption. The heme iron consumption is generally the same and low, although we actually saw an increase. We did see it's rounded to 1, but this is 0.05 or something, and this at the end here is about 1. And we could see it in the groups that, somehow that only about 44% of households at the baseline were consuming heme iron-rich foods at least once a week. At the end line, 61% of households are doing this at least once a week, and 1% are actually doing it every 7 days a week. Or, it doesn't mean that every day of the week they're doing it, but they're consuming a very strong amount of heme iron-rich food. So, and then we disaggregate this as well. We see that for male and female headed households, the trends are largely the same and similar to the population. We see with households with disability that they started off much lower in vitamin A, but seem to have caught up by the end line, about the same, 7.3, 7.4. And here you see this similar thing with heme iron, a bit lower at the baseline, same at the end line. I don't know if we had statistical significance. We had a significant increase for all of the groups.
Even the iron, it shows that a little bit, but there is.
Yeah, even the heme iron increased from, this is like 2/3 of a day to 1.06, but it was just statistically significant. So it is an increase. But there was not big difference between the groups, between the households, either by household and sex or disability status. Dietary diversity score also, this is rounded. It's a small but significant increase from, I think, just less than 6 to just over 6 at the end line. And you can see also a slight uptick in the number of families that have good diversity. They're eating 7 groups a week, and a decrease in those who have low diversity, or 0 to 3 groups a week, which is great. And this again tells us that people are not just eating staples and pulses and sort of basic foodstuffs to meet their dietary requirements, but they have a nicely diversified diet. For the most part, people are eating 4 to 6 food groups a week. When we disaggregate it by household head sex, on average, it's about the same. And in terms of the groups, it's also about the same. But we see that female-headed households actually maybe had a little bit better gains here. The male-headed households that are in the good group only increased by 1%. The female-headed households went up by 6%. I don't think that this was statistically significant either, but it's worth pointing out. And then the same basic trend for those with disabilities and those without. So we can say that in terms of food consumption metrics that are about sort of the family's intake and utilization of food, these are looking generally similar across the groups, disaggregation groups.
هون عم نحكي بالأغلبية عم نحكي على المؤشرات التابعة للاستهلاك الغذائي، زي ما حكينا، زي التنوع الغذائي، زي يعني هون احنا هلا عم نحكي بشكل اسرع، يعني ما بده يكون في شرح كثير لانه احنا فقط عم نورجي النتائج. هذا القسم عم نورجي في نتائج، وتقدروا انتم تعملوا ديس اجريجيت او انكم تعملوها كروس تاب مع الشيء انتم بتشوفوه انه بدكم تورجوا الريزلتس تبعونه. احنا دائما بنختار الهاوسهولد 6 وبنختار برضه اذا عندهم اعاقه او ما عندهم اعاقه بالبيت. في عندك ممكن تضيف اشياء كثير لها تعملها وتضيفها بالريزلتس. هون بالريزلتس احنا فقط بنورجي، ما بنشرح ولا شيء، احنا فقط بنورجي الريزلتس النتائج ونشوف اذا هي significant او لا. زي ما السيد علي حكى لنا بنشوف التي تيست تبعتها او انه significancy، بنعمل تيست لها ونشوف اذا هي significant من البيس لاين للاند لاين. تمام. هاي الاغلبيه كان الكريس عم بشرحها. فهون هاي كل مؤشرات الاستهلاك الغذائي. هلا رح نبلش ب اللي هي استراتيجيات المواجهه لتامين الغذاء واللي هي الار سي اس اي. برضه هون بس عم نورجي اجين هم النتائج، بس عم نورجي الريزلتس، عم نحط اذا في significant not significant عشان نترك مجال بالدسكشن نشرح، نربط كل الانديكيتورز مع بعض او المؤشرات مع بعض ونكتب القصه هناك. تمام.
So at this point, we're going to ask a question again: is what can we say about the household food security at this point, knowing now, having reported the food consumption score, the nutrition sensitive food consumption, and the dietary diversity score, both about the overall and also about the groups, the disaggregation groups or the cross-tabbed groups, so by male, female, household head, or those households with or without disabilities.
كنت عم بسألكم انه هلا احنا خلصنا مؤشرات الاستهلاك الغذائي، كل الاشياء متعلق فيها، يعني كان تبعت قديش بياخذوا منها عناصر غذائيه، التنوع الغذائي، والمؤشر الاستهلاك الغذائي نفسه. يعني بشكل عام ايش ممكن انتم تحكوا عن الوضع الامن الغذائي للاسر قبل ما نكمل؟ فانتم هلا بدنا نشوف بس انتم شو بتحكوا عن وضع الامن الغذائي للاسر، حتى لما عملنا لها كروس تاب وديس اجريجيتد على مستوى رب الاسره، اذا كانوا ذكر او انثى او اذا عندهم اعاقه او لا. فانتم هلا من شفتوا النتائج هاي، بس شو رايكم بوضع الامن الغذائي للاسره؟ طيب انا راح اختار يا صالح يا عمار، لأن انتم مع بعض. صالح وعمار معنا؟ صالح وعمار اوكي مش معنا. طلال معنا ولا مش معنا؟ طلال، الو طلال، سيد طلال. طيب في طب علي، سيد علي، ما سمعنا صوتك اليوم. لا انتم سامعيني ولا مش سامعيني يا جماعه عن جد؟
شكلهم اليوم نايمين،
ليترلي
ما في صوت.
سامعينك بس. طب سامعيني ردوا علي. طب ما إلا غير شيرين. شيرين ولا شو رأيك بوضع ايش اسمه؟ طب يعني عم بنادي عليك انت قاعد هذا. طب عبرني رد علي. اللي بده يحكي بدنا حدا يحكي انه كيف لاحظتوا الوضع؟ كيف وضع الامن الغذائي لهلا من مؤشرات الاستهلاك الغذائي؟ مين في حدا رافع ايده؟ شيرين تفضل يا شيرين.
لاحظنا تحسن بوضع الأمن الغذائي بشكل عام، بس يعني هالتحسن إنه مو يعني هالفارق الكبير بين الفيميل والميل، وبين مع وجود الديسابيليتي ونو ديسابيليتي. بس هذه
يعني اللي كان بشكل عام انت قصدك فيه تحسن، تمام؟ بس انه لما عملنا ديس اجريجيتد ما في التحسن. يس تمام. شكرا شيرين. نشوف ايش هوني. علي المايك خربان مش مشكلة معك. اوكي لاحظ انه ما في تغيير كثير. اوكي علي and let's go. Shireen first. Shireen said that an overall there's an improvement in the food consumption score or in the food security situation of the household, but whenever we disaggregate it according to the household head 6 and the disability, there is not much of a change between both of them. There's no significant differences. Ali is saying, there's no significant changes, especially for the household head 6. But in an overall, there is an improvement in the food security situation. And even for the disability and no disability for the households. But the overall, I think there is an improvement. Mm-hmm. But this is when I want to add another question, Chris, to the trainees. Do you think that would be a representative to say that, or I could surely 100% say that the food security situation of the households improved and they are better now? انه انا قصدي انه انا هلا بقدر احكي 100% بعد ما شفت هدول 3 مؤشرات انه الوضع الغذائي تحسن للاسر. بقدر احكيها فقط من انه انا شفت مؤشرات الاستهلاك الغذائي. شو يا جماعه؟ شيرين، ما لنا غير شيرين او سعاد.
Yes, definitely. No, we cannot say it. In general, the consumption score and the diet, it shows that an improvement. But definitely, we need to consider and to take in consideration the other indicators, the coping strategy indicator and the livelihood act as well, in order to say or to judge the overall situation for this population.
Exactly. Thank you, Suad. Yes. The thing is, we need to look at other indicators, though. The overall, I am with you, Ali. Ali is saying, the disaggregated one is there's no significant differences, but in the overall, there was a significant differences. يعني بالoverall بالشكل عام كان في تحسن, but still we can't say that the food security situation of the households improved, while we need to look at other indicators to build up that story of these beneficiaries. يعني احنا ما بنقدر نطلع على فقط هاي المؤشرات نحكي الوضع الغذائي تبعه تحسن بشكل عام, ولكن لازم نطلع على مؤشرات اخرى, تمام, حتى نكتب القصة الصحيحة ونعرف الوضع بشكل اكثر. تمام.
Yeah, exactly. We can say, if we think about the 3 pillars of food security, we could say essentially the utilization of food is good. Utilization of food is good, and it's improving over time in our sample. But we can't say that the households are food secure necessarily. And so it's important. Yeah, you often hear people say the food security situation improved because we saw the FCS, the DDS, the FCSM increase. But actually, that just means that the consumption of food is better. The utilization of food is better, but their food security situation is also, of course, to do with the availability of food, to do with whether or not they had to enact coping strategies to access the food. So those 2 things, we haven't really measured them yet. So then we go in the results and we start reporting on the coping strategies. So here we see exactly why we need to think about the coping strategies, because even though we saw the food consumption score go up, the number of households, or the share of households that were in a good, acceptable food consumption increase. They had better dietary diversity. They had better nutritional status not nutritional status, sorry, that's another technical term, but the nutritional content of what they were eating was better. But the RCSI essentially doubled. The use of consumption-based coping strategies doubled from the baseline to the end line. And from the baseline, we had 40% of households who were basically not using consumption-based coping strategies. That gets cut more than in half. At the end line, only 18%. The stressed category stays about the same size. The share of households that are in crisis to emergency coping over 18 RCSI, which is using a ton of coping strategies, it's tripled. And then we see the RCSI disaggregated by household had sex. And here I'll stop and just ask what you can take away from, or were the female-headed or the male-headed households impacted more in terms of their use of food consumption-based coping strategies, or who's using more food consumption-based coping strategies between these two groups of households?
كريس عم بسأل هنا ورجاكم الاستراتيجيات المواجهة لتأمين الغذاء، وكان زي ما شفنا انه صار في تغيير كتير كبير. يعني مش انه زي ما علي كاتب انه مثلا اذا هون صار في على تغيير، صار عندك تراجع، يعني انه كل ما زادت الاستراتيجيات يعني احنا الناس هم مش مؤمنين غذائيا. يعني احنا بنعرف الوضع الامن الغذائي تبعهم مش كتير جيد. بس كريس بالاخير سأل انه مين اكثر عم يستخدم استراتيجيات مواجهه، ربة الاسره الانثى ولا رب الاسره الذكر؟
Anyone?
Okay, female. Another one said male.
Tamam, yeah. So actually, both of those answers are correct. Ashan, we can see the baseline. Female-headed households actually were using more coping strategies. At the end line, male-headed households used more coping strategies than female-headed households. At the baseline, 14% of female-headed households are in the crisis to emergency category, whereas for males, 10% of those households are in this category. However, there's some nuance here because 42% of male-headed households are in the none to low, 35% of female. Actually, that holds up. Male-headed households seem to be doing a bit better at the baseline. By the end line, male-headed households have more than tripled the share of male-headed households that are using crisis to emergency levels of consumption-based coping. Female-headed households have doubled, but still below this number. Actually, more of them are in the low category, although it's small for both. Important to note also that the trend is similar to what's going on in the population as a whole. None of these groups is somehow going opposite direction or whatever. So they're all behaving similarly. But generally they're doing about the same. The reason that both of the answers are correct is that actually this difference here and this difference here, so the difference between these households at the baseline and then the difference between households at the end line are not statistically significant differences. So male and female-headed households, statistically speaking, so our confidence in the difference being really what we see in the population, not actually that different, right? However, it's still important to report this because what we see is that male-headed households, you can have this phenomenon where we see that the difference at the end line and the baseline are not statistically significantly different. But the male-headed households went from lower to higher in both of these, in both the average and in the groups. This is sort of an important point because just because we don't see a statistically significant difference doesn't mean the difference isn't important to report. So in this case, we said, look, the difference is significant, but the male-headed households experience a larger increase in their use of consumption-based coping strategies. Yeah, you can go ahead.
تمام. هلا اللي كان يحكي لكم اياه كريس مبدئيا انه احنا بنطلع اول شيء على الافرج، يعني على المين للار سي اس اي، فبنلاحظ بين الميل والفيميل سواء كان ذكر وانثى انه الفرق مش كثير كبير. ليش؟ لانه اذا بنطلع على البيز لاين رح نلاقي انه الفيميل كانت 9، كانت اكثر من الميل اللي هو 7، والاند لاين كمان هي صارت اقل 14 والميل صار 15. فما بنقدر بكل ثقه نحكي انه والله الميل وضعها تحسن او الفيميل وضعه صار اسوء، لانه اصلا البيز لاين فيه اختلاف. هلا اذا طلعنا على الكاتيجوريز نفسهم هون بيعطينا معلومات زياده. ليش؟ لانه عم نشوف من البيز لاين للميل لما راح على الاند لاين المجموعه اللي لونها اورنج، يعني المجموعه اللي بيستخدموا اللي هي كرايسيس لامرجنسي ار سي اس اي، يعني بيستخدموا اكثر ار سي اس اي زادت. المجموعه الصفراء كمان تقريبا نفس الشيء، الاخضر قل. نفس الشيء للفيميل، بس التغير صار بالميل بنسبه اكثر. اوكي، هذا بيعطينا مؤشر انه العائلات اللي بتكون ميل هيدد هاوس هولدز صار في عندها استخدام اكثر للار سي اس اي. هلا عاده لما يكون في عندنا هاي الفروقات البسيطه ايش بنعمل بالاحصاء؟ بنعمل اللي هو شيء اسمه تي تيست عشان نتاكد انه هاي الفروقات يعني هي فروقات حقيقيه. تمام، وبكل ثقه بنقدر نحكي انه هذا الفرق بين الميل والفيميل انه هو فاليد، انه هو مزبوط يعني. فلما عملنا التيتاس بين معنا انه not significant. مع هيك ما يعني هذا الموضوع ما بينفي المعلومات اللي عم بتزيدها هذا السكشن، انه اوكي ممكن الافرج ما بيقدر يعطيني كثير معلومات، بس اذا بطلع على الكاتيجوريز الحركه بتزيد لي كمان معلومات. شيء ثاني اذا بنطلع على الافرج تاع البوبيوليشن مش تاع الفيميل والميل بيحكي نفس القصه، يعني بورجينا انه الافرج بالاند لاين زاد، وورجانا انه الحركه بين الجروبس للار سي اس اي نفس الحركه بين الموجوده بين الدوكيومنتد بين الميل والفيميل. فهذا بورجينا انه مثلا انه ما في شيء مختلف لمثلا الفيميل هيدد هاوس هولدز، تمام، او انه واحده من هاي المجموعات ما عم تتبع الترند الموجوده. فهاي الفكره الاساسيه ليش احنا يعني بنقارن مع البوبيوليشن، بنرجع على نفس الفيميل والميل، نطلع على الكاتيجوريز لانه كل واحده منهم تعطينا فكره، يعني بتاكد لنا على المعلومات الاساسيه وممكن تزيد لنا كمان معلومات زياده. تمام.
So this is actually a good also thing to think about now. We see this difference, but what is this? How do you now tell a story about this in the discussion that makes sense? So why are male-headed households seeing a much bigger increase in the use of coping strategies, while female-headed households, they got worse as well? Both of them had a statistically significant increase within their group, but the female-headed households seem to have started off not as using more coping strategies, but ended up using less than the male-headed households. Why would we see this change, dramatic change, and more change in the male-headed households than the female?
كريس عم يسأل إنه برأيكم ليش مثلاً عم نشوف بالعائلات اللي هي الميل هيدد هاوس هولدز عم بيستخدموا أكثر استراتيجيات الار سي اس اي؟ إيش برأيكم في إشي نذكر قبل بالديموغرافيكس بيعكس هذا الموضوع؟ يعني أنا غششتكم شوي. فكروا شوفوا إيش يعني هذا إشي كتير مهم يعني خاصة بالدسكشنز بنعكسها. إيش رأيكم؟ أحمد التحسر.
And a hint is that it was obviously this is a study that happened before and after COVID. So
كان عم بيحكي كريس انه كمان هاي الدراسه كانت قبل كوفيد، البيسنا كان قبل كوفيد والاند لاين صارت بعد كوفيد. شو يا جماعه؟ والله هلكتونا اليوم قاعدين برجاكم تجاوبوا يا جماعه ماكو. هو بصير ممل اذا احنا حنضلنا نكمل هيك وكمان اونلاين. يعني انتم رح تصيروا تملوا اكثر، ما رح يصير في عندك مشاركه اكثر، وبنقدر نخلص على فكره البرزنتيشن بساعه يعني، بس احنا حابين نشارك ونشوف رايكم، يعني يصير في ديسكشن. فشو رايكم بالحكوا يا جماعه؟ يس علي تفضل. هلا احنا ما عم نقدر نسمعك علي. علي احنا ما عم نسمعك. لا ما عم نسمعك علي حبيبي. اوكي اكتب هاي اوكي تمام.
did we lose Ali?
طيب within that
تمام.
هتكون المناقشة عم تتم باختبار كاي سكوير وهو باين غير معنوي قيمة ال PA. هذا شو الفائدة من المجالات بمؤشر RSSI؟ زي ما حكينا he's saying like he's saying that there's no significance between male and female household head, and what is the benefit of showing this disaggregation? And even now, even in the RSSI, it's not showing. Okay, in the food consumption score, there wasn't a significance between them, and there is now in the RSSI, there is also no significance. So
Yeah.
بس في عندك بالديسابيلتي تشوف انه في عندك significance almost يعني بس okay.
Yeah. Actually the important thing here is that even though there's no significance at baseline or at end line, we would need a more advanced statistical method. We'd be doing oh my gosh. We're using regression to figure out if the change itself that we saw is different based on the household head sex, rather than just the difference at the baseline or the difference at the end line. But when we see this effect where the male starts lower and ends higher, even though there's no significance, we see that but the increase is much larger for male-headed households, then we want to still mention it. We want to report it because this means that something is going on where male-headed households are starting off at a better position, ending up at a worse position relative to their female-headed households, even though the significance is not different at the baseline and the end line. We can see that there's something. Significance isn't everything. Significance just means that we don't have. We're not able to say that 95% of the time this outcome wouldn't happen if the population was different. But besides for the significance in the test, we still see this difference quite dramatic where the male-headed households are starting off better and ending up slightly worse. And so we want to explain it. Maybe for the sake of time, I'll just give you our explanation, which is that male-headed households in the baseline are more likely to have members that are working. If you remember from our demographic discussion as well, male-headed households tend to be a bit bigger. So there's two factors combined mean that male-headed household at the beginning of the study maybe had somebody working, had more non-dependents, had more adults that were working. The end line, we're seeing the effect of COVID-19. In Jordan, they lost the ability to work for 3 months. And even if they got their work back by the time that we came back and surveyed them, they still didn't have, their economic capacity was very much diminished. Whereas female-headed households tended to maybe rely a bit more on aid at the baseline and at the end line, meaning that the shock wasn't quite as big when COVID hit, because maybe this household is has to do a little bit more coping because they're relying more on aid. They're not able to bring in as much income. But then when the economy shuts down, they don't lose that income. So they don't have to go as extreme. I mean, we still see them using more coping strategies. And this is obviously because the pandemic is also affecting them. But this is just some reasons that we can give as to why we observe something different going on. So yeah, I don't know, Ahmed, if you can translate that.
انه هون احنا عم نشوف اوكي احنا برضه ما في significance بس لما نطلع على البيس لاين او اللي ما حكى كريس انه عم نطلع الذكور اوكي رب الاسره الذكر كان وضعه شوي عم بيعمل احسن من الانثى. تمام؟ رحنا شفنا على الاند لاين اوكي ما في هالتغيير كثير بيناتهم، ولكن كان عم بيستخدم استراتيجيات كثير اقل من الانثى. بس بالاند لاين صار الانثى لحقت وصاروا تقريبا زي بعض، مع انه الاثنين اتدهورت حالتهم بشكل كثير كبير، ولكن صاروا الاثنين تقريبا صار حتى الميل انه ايش اسمه يعني حالته اسوء من الفيميل باستخدام استراتيجيات لتامين الغذاء. فنرجع هذا كله بنربطه مع بعضه كيف يعني مثلا نحن نعرف انه مثلا بنربطه بالامبلويمنت ستيتس مثلا. اوكي يمكن الفيميل هدول الفيميل انت بتعرف صعب يلاقوا شغل، بس يمكن لما لقوا الاسيستنت اجتهم اسيستنت اكثر، يمكن الفيميل عندهم بيت اصغر او انه عدد افراد اسر اصغر، فهذا ممكن الدليل انه خلتها انه تستخدم اقل استراتيجيات من غيره. مش significant change، ولكن في change بنقدر نحكي انه كيف ليش كانوا الميل بيعملوا احسن انه ما يستخدموا استراتيجيات قد الفيميل، بعديها صار عندك صاروا يستخدموا استراتيجيات اكثر من الفيميل. مفهومه؟ بس ما بعرف علي. بس كاوفر اول سيد علي احنا كمان بنشوف انه كثير تدهورت الامور بالنسبه اذا بدنا ناخذها كاستراتيجيات مواجهه تامين الغذاء. انت بتحكي صاروا البوينتس نطت تقريبا الدبل، يعني ضاعفت يعني هم هذا الدليل انه عم يستخدموا استراتيجيات اكثر عشان يامنوا الغذاء. ممكن نقدر نحكي بسبب استخدام استراتيجيات اكثر يمكن الفود كونسبشن سكور يتحسن عندهم كمان. فانت عم تحكي عن عده اسباب ممكن تتعلق ببعض. تمام.
And one other thing is it's important always to, you want to report on the disaggregation, even if there's no significance, because you want to, if it's the same, that's important to know for the male and the female, or the disability and non-disability, even if it's the same. And if it's different, we want to definitely catch it. But it's good to know that that this is the case. This is a case here with the disability status where we saw a statistically significant difference, both at the baseline and the end line. For RCSI, households with disability are using more consumption-based coping in both scenarios, and the increase is massive for households with disability. I mean, there's even a huge increase for those without disability, but these almost getting close to half of households are in a crisis to emergency status for those with disability. So that's a good example of the trend is the same as the population generally. There's a big increase for both groups. The situation is getting worse for everybody, but it's definitely hitting households with disability harder. So this is a great example of why we disaggregate, because we want to catch something like this, where the households with disability, both at the baseline, are starting off worse, and they're getting even worse than the households with no disability by the end line.
هون هاي المثال علي مثلا ببين انه الترند واحد، الاثنين المجموعتين اتاثروا. تمام. المجموعتين صاروا يستخدموا استراتيجيات اكثر، ولكن احنا بدنا نطلع على مع اسره في على القليله عندها اعاقه وحده عندها بالبيت، انت عم تشوف عم تستخدم استراتيجيات بشكل كثير اكبر من النو ديسابيلتي. اذا ما عندهم ديسابيلتي انت هي بتشوف الرقم بالاند لاين كان هو 13 ولكن بالديسابيلتي 19. هاي عندك تطلع عندنا significant كانت between them. هلا اوكي الترند بيس على الاند لاين اثنين زادوا، بس حتى لو نقارن نشوف بالكاتيجوريز، انت شوف الديسابيلتي الامرجنسي او الكرايسيس كان 16% منهم ايش اسمه بالامرجنسي. هلا عم تحكي عن 14% تقريبا، صار عندك تريبل، يعني نط هذا للتريبل. يعني عرفت كيف؟ وعندك برضه نفس الشيء للنو ديسابيلتي بالامرجنسي زادت كثير، بس بالويز ديسابيلتي حالتهم كانت اسوء من نو ديسابيلتي. تمام؟
And also we can think of this alongside a food consumption score, where we saw not a big difference between households with and without disability. But when we got to the RCSI, we saw that this pattern is not as sustainable for these households with disability, even though they're consuming about the same. So this is that layers of food security analysis. Now we can start to say households with disability are consuming the same, but we're worried that this is not sustainable for them, or they're doing it at a big cost to their family. And one of the ways we see that is when we look at individual coping strategies, where we see that both the use of any strategy at all increases, and then the use of specific coping strategies increases as well. And the biggest concern we have is reducing adult consumption, which from the RCSI severity weight, we know that we consider this to be the most severe strategy, because it is economically risky for the family to be taking their adults who can work and reducing their consumption. This means that they may suffer in terms of their ability to work or something like that.
Yeah, that's a good question here. I want to ask one question. Why do you think the board food decreased while other increase.
Yeah.
كنت عم بحكي لكريس، بدي اسال سؤال هون لو تقدروا تجاوبوا لي، انه كل الاستراتيجيات لتامين الغذاء زادت ما عدا البورد فود، او انه اللي هي انه اخذ الاكل بالاقتراض او بالبيت. ليش رايكم يا جماعه؟ ليش فكركم هي الوحيده اللي قلت؟ ايش في ايدياز او انه ديسكشن يصير انه ليش قلت؟ شو رايكم يا جماعه؟ يعني انا ما بدي لا علي ولا سعاد ولا شيرين يجاوبوا، لانه هم عم بيجاوبوا. بدي اشوف مين معي. في مرفاد، عماد، صالح، عمار، طلال. شو رايكم؟ معي انتو؟ طلال، صالح، عمار، مرفاد، عماد. معي انتو يا جماعه؟ طيب شكرا، مش معانا. نرجع لعلي وسعاد وشيرين. شو رأيكم؟ ليش البورد فود او انه اخذ الطعام بالاقتراض او انه اقتراض الطعام قل بالنسبه لباقي الاستراتيجيات، مع انه الاستراتيجيات الثانيه كلها زادت؟ ليش يا جماعه؟ ايش السبب فكركم؟ اعطونا اسباب.
سؤال تفضلي.
If we are talking specifically in the period related to COVID, relatively everyone had limited access to market. So I would say maybe this is one of the reasons. And I don't know, this is what I have in mind for now. The limited access to the market and this variety of food in the market as well.
Actually, this is amazing. Yes, they have limited because of COVID and the lockdown. And also, there's another thing. Whenever we say board and or ticket on credit, already people who was in the market or the business owners, they are being affected by COVID. So they're not going to be able to give food on credit anymore because they need cash. You know, this is all other stuff. It's related to COVID. Actually, that's why COVID impacted this study and the results of this study big way, you know. So and Ali is saying that they are depending more in reducing the number of meals and the portion of the meals and other stuff. And برضو كمان Ali, we can add COVID affected the limited access and how it affected the market at all, you know. So people are not being able to borrow food or able to give food on credit.
And another reason for this is that we also will consider this if somebody borrowed food from a neighbor or a friend. And we know that the ability people are more cautious to be going to people's houses, to be having contact with each other. So this is another reason why borrowed food may have gone down. But I think the market reason is probably more significant. The other thing that was when we saw that this reduced adult consumption was there, this is something that we actually did in the qualitative follow-up. We asked, like, why are you relying so much on this reducing adult consumption? And we selected families that had been using it to do a qualitative follow-up. And we found that I should say Hanouf and Ahmed.
You can go up a little bit. There's a quote.
Hanouf and Ahmed did these studies, so they can explain that.
يعني واحدة من الكوت عمل لك كواليتيتيف عشان نشوف ليش زاد انه ليش هاي استراتيجية انه الكبار قل اكلهم تمام عشان ياكلوا صغار. ايش كتبوا؟ انه واحدة من الاسباب our kids are eating more frequently, therefore the adults in the households restrict their meals and reduce their meals proportions. يعني هون بورجينا ليش عم نستخدم استراتيجيات اكثر. اول شيء مع اللوك داون اللي صار وكانت هي بالشتاء تقريبا وما فيش مدارس وبالبيت قاعدين، فالاولاد زهقانين مش قادرين يطلعوا، صاروا الاولاد ياكلوا اكثر. فعشان الاهل يدبروا لهم اكل، صاروا يقللوا اكلهم هم او يقللوا حجم الوجبه. يعني اوكي ياكلوا اكثر من مره بس حجم الوجبه اقل. فهاي كانت واحده من الكواليتيف كوتس. دائما لما تعملوا كواليتيف حطوا كوتس كثير كثير مفيدين، بتعبر لك. يعني هو قايل لك our kids are eating more frequently therefore their adults in the household restrict their meals and reduce their meals proportions. عرفتوا؟ فعلى طول لما عملنا كواليتيف احنا صرنا في اشياء كنا مستغربينها، طب ليش زاد لهالدرجه؟ طب احنا الرقم مش قادرين نعطيه تفسير، عم نحاول نربطه هون وهون ما عندنا تفسير، فبالاخير عملنا كواليتيف وطلع معنا هذا الجواب.
Yeah, so it's good example of how these individual strategies can deepen the analysis. And also I'll just mention that when we did because we saw a significant difference among the households with disability, we also disaggregated this. We didn't do it for the household had sex because even though we said that there's an important difference, the significance in the difference of just the RCSI in general led us to also look more deeply at how the households with disabilities were coping. We see that they're basically following the trend of the population, but they're using these strategies that are being increased. The increase is even bigger for each of these households. There's a 10 percentage point difference at the end line in use of the reducing adult consumption. So we can see that they are being more. The trend that we see in the population is even more severe for those with disabilities. Okay, so we can go through LCSI as well. We'll do it quickly. So we do report the livelihood LCSI overall and disaggregate it by household had sex and by disability. Generally speaking, everything is fairly similar to what we saw. There's an increase in LCSI and a big increase in people who are at the emergency or crisis level, and are using essentially at least one crisis or emergency strategy. Male and female, fairly similar, although the female-headed households tended to have a higher LCSI score at the baseline, but the difference was there's no difference at the end line. And then by disability status, we saw again a significantly higher use of livelihood coping strategies for those who were affected by a disability. You can see that the number or the percentage of households using emergency strategies is the same for the baseline of disability and the end line of no disability. And by the end line, I think basically 80% of households with disability were using at least one emergency or at least one crisis strategy, and none of them were avoiding using livelihood coping strategies. We ask, again, these are all great places when you disaggregate, or not disaggregate, but when you look at the individual use of strategies, you can see that people are spending savings. You're buying food on credit a little bit more, but not much more. They're reducing non-food expenditure. So this is sort of prioritizing food expenditure over other things like education and health. There's an increase in withdrawing children from school, sending kids to work, and also accepting socially degrading jobs. So this is good also to get an idea of sort of what's going on for families, and this is also a good place to think of if you're going to do qualitative follow-up, what you're going to ask about these specific strategies. For example, we asked about withdrawing children from school. This is related a lot to the fact that online school is seen as not as good of an investment, was not as effective for them. And also the internet costs were keeping them from from having their kids pursue school outside of when it was remote learning. Come on. We also, in this study, we were reported by geographic region and also by governorates, and then also we reported the headline stuff by household heads or by household size. This was not part of our initial plan, but because we saw that big increase in the size of households, we decided to disaggregate that as well. And that's something, again, when you're doing the analysis, you see some kind of trend, see something happening, but you think it's interesting in the demographics. It's good to think about what I can now use crosstabs to look into, not just, oh, the household size increased, but what did that mean for food security? You see that the large households actually got better, while the small households got worse. Slightly, but it was a difference. And the same thing, or not the same thing actually. The large households though were using more coping strategies, although there was an increase for everyone, and the same for livelihood coping strategies. And this helps us also think about what we're going to say when we discuss it. We do this for longitudinal, like we showed you. If you don't have the same households baseline end line, you cannot do these graphs. But if you have it, it's a really interesting analysis. Okay, we're getting to now expenditure and debt. We'll just go over the headlines. So we look at the total food and non-food expenditure. And we do it for overall and per capita. We see the increase in all the categories of expenditure. Food expenditure actually was not a significant increase, which is interesting in that we're studying what happened when these households got WFP food assistance. They got it in cash. They got it for the purpose of purchasing more food, but the expenditure went to non-food more. This means that not that the households don't need food, but that apparently the need for non-food expenditure increased more than the need for food expenditure. However, we see also that because the household size increased, the per capita expenditure goes down, and this is important because we just see the expenditure go up. We say, oh, the household's spending more. That's great. They have more money to spend because they got WFP assistance. Wonderful. But when we see what actually happened with the per capita expenditure, it goes down because even though the family is spending more, they have more mouths to feed. So it's important to also report per capita because that's how we can think about, is everybody getting enough within the household as well. And then we disaggregate it by sex. We see actually that female-headed households are spending less than male-headed households at both time points. The per capita is not as different. I don't know, do you think we have time to ask him another question?
That was for the discussion, because we're gonna have only 5 minutes.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Maybe in the discussion, we can talk and ask these questions for them.
Yeah, let's do that. Okay. Tamam, we also have food expenditure share.
Yes, okay.
True reports. It seemed to get better over the course of the study
But here, let's tag here why the food expenditure share is getting less than 50%. Mostly there. frequent. We were like focusing more on preventing, but that's what I think which is. So يا جماعة بدي أسألكم هون ليش بشكل عام الفود اكسبندشر شير كاتيجوري احنا دائما نعرف شوفوا الأحمر إنه هو أعلى من 75% بس قلت يعني هيك بتبين إنه هي تحسنت بس هي مش متحسنة بس ليش السبب إنه الفود فود اكسبندشر شير قل ليش؟ شو رأيكم يا جماعة؟ شيرين يس جو اهيد شيرين.
لأنه عم يحطوا على الأجار أكثر وكمان خاصة إنه الإنلاين صار بعد الكوفيد 19 فبيكونوا عم يحطوا على الصحة أكثر.
Okay, that's a good way. And Shireen said that because it happened after COVID, okay, maybe they're putting more on health and maybe they're putting more expenditure on rent. They're preferring to put on money on rent than food. So exactly, yeah. Yes, yeah, you hit the point. Thank you, Shireen. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, we see exactly that the expenditure on, and especially actually we saw somewhere in here we have health expenditure didn't change very much, but the rent expenditure went up a lot. And that's because basically the pressure on people as the economic situation decreased to keep a roof over their head became more important than even eating. And so that's one way that the food expenditure share itself is you have to read it carefully because otherwise you think, oh, it's great. They're spending less as a share of their income on food or share of their expenditure on food. But we know in this case, it was because they were scared of getting evicted, not because they had, not because they were necessarily, you know, their budget was all of a sudden much better.
Yeah, I want to add to that to Chris. Whenever we did the qualitative follow-up, لما عملنا الكواليتيف كثير ناس حكوا المساعدات اللي أخذناها 90% حطوهم للأجار. تخيل إذا رجع يعني المساعدات بياخذوهم للغذاء. اوكي بس اخذوا 90% منهم عشان يدفعوا الاجار ومره كانوا يحكوا احنا صراحه ننام جوعانين ولا انه ننام بالشارع او انه نروح على مسجد او اي شيء اهم شيء نخلي فوق راسنا سقف. What I'm saying also in the qualitative Chris, whenever we did it, some of the households said like they use 90% of the WFP food assistance for rent, which means and it was supposed to used to spend on food, and many of them said like we prefer to have a roof on our top rather than living in the street or in a mosque.
Yeah, exactly. That's an important point as well that when you have these findings, you have numbers, right? You interpret them as much as you can, but having a qualitative follow-up, if you can do it, even I think we did 48 families in this scenario?
48 families, yes.
Out of 650. So we chose them based on the numbers we had. We chose families who we knew were struggling more because we wanted to get a sense of, okay, we see that some families are struggling, let's understand their situation a bit better. And then this interpretation gets more, it's helpful to know the situation of the families. Because at the end of the day, we're trying to say what's happening with these households. It's hard to do that with just numbers. So we have to think more deeply about what's going on. And often it helps to ask them literally what's going on. Tamam, okay, we don't have much time.
Yes. I don't know, Salah, that we could we have another like 15-20 minutes just to talk about the discussion.
بدكم تاخذوا كمان ربع ساعة؟
يعني ربع ساعة ثلث ساعة. I don't know if the trainees or المتدربين حابين يضلوا أكثر شوي نحكي عن discussion يعني.
براحتهم صراحة لأنه إحنا أصلاً بلشنا على 10:03.
وهاي هي.
فممكن ناخذ كمان ربع ساعة أو 20 دقيقة.
Exactly. لأنه already إحنا بلشنا متأخر. Yes. فخلينا نعوض الثلث ساعة اللي تأخرنا فيها بعد الوحدة. يعني الوحدة وثلث تكون مخلصين.
إن شاء الله.
Thank you, Salah. We can have another 20 minutes because we already started 20 minutes later.
Come on. Okay, so now for the discussion. I guess maybe we should just ask, like, how would you interpret these numbers for those, after reading through them or after seeing what the situation, how would you sort of sum up the food security situation and also explain it?
كريس عم بيحكي انه ممكن احسن بدل ما نروح على الدسكشن نشوف انتم شو رايكم، انتم شفتوا الريزلتس، شفتوا النتائج، تمام، وشفتوا نتائج مؤشرات الامن الغذائي وكل شيء، كيف تقدروا تربطوهم مع بعض وتعطونا شيء زي ملخص لهم. خلينا نروح على شيرين لانه هي دائما هذا. شيرين شو رايك؟ شيرين ما تروحي شيرين، اذا رحتي خلاص الصف عندنا بس وعد وعلي. شيرين معنا؟
ايش
يس. هلا زي ما كنا عم نحكي انه كله هلا احنا ورجيناكم الريزلتس، كيف تقدروا تربطوا لنا اياهم كلهم مع بعض وتعطينا ملخص عنه؟
هلا اول شيء باول المخططات شفنا انه الامن الغذائي تحسن، ولكن بعد ما شفنا الاستراتيجيات الثانيه شفنا انه لا بالعكس، يعني انه الوضع صار أسوأ. هلا ما كان في كثير اختلاف بين الميل والفيميل والعوائل فيها اعاقه او ما فيها اعاقه، الارقام كانت تقريبا نفس الشيء. بس يعني انه بشكل عام انه الناس صارت تصرف على غير الاكل اكثر، لانه مثل ما ذكروا اول شيء انه هن عم يحطوا على الاجارات اكثر ويحطوا على الصحه، وكمان انه في ناس كثار يعني بعد الكوفيد توقفوا عن الشغل، فمشان هيك انه يعني هن صاروا بحاجه اكثر يعني.
وشو رايك بالوضع الغذائي تبعهم كملخص؟
هلا هن عم يستخدموا استراتيجيات تكيف، يعني صاروا يستخدموا استراتيجيات تكيف اكثر من قبل، فهذا بدل انه يعني هن غير مؤمنين غذائيا.
يعني مع انه الفود كونسبشن سكور كان كثير عالي صح؟ يعني تحسن قصدي بشكل عام، ولكن ما بنقدر ما نطلع على
ما بنقدر نقول عليها اذا ما شفنا الاستراتيجيات الثانيه.
اوكي، شكرا كثير. What Shireen said, Chris, is from the result that we had, okay, we can see that the food consumption score increased. There's more variety and diversity in their food, and some nutrients intake improved. But at the same time, whenever we see the coping strategies for both the food consumption and the livelihood coping strategies, it increased significantly, and that also would give us an indication that their food security situation decreased or deteriorate. And also added to that, looking at the food expenditures with the non-food expenditures and the food expenditure share, we can see that not because the situation is improved, their food consumption, their food expenditure share increased, but because they are more spending maybe on health or maybe on rent, especially rent, and many of them, they lost their jobs, so they are more vulnerable. So this was summary of the chain, and it was actually great.
Yeah, that's perfect. Yeah, exactly. So we see an increase in the utilization of food, and an increase in the diversity of the intake, which is good. But we also see this effect of, and I mean, in this case, we say it's the effect of COVID-19. It's hard in this years where COVID-19 is impacting people to really, because it's happening all over the place. But if you think about reporting in Northeast Syria, you may see somehow the situation for a particular area is affected by another thing like conflict or or the Syrian pound, inflation, something like this. So we see that, and we expect to see that actually in the livelihood coping strategies, the food consumption strategies, and maybe also in the expenditure data. So we, yeah, exactly. We see that the food consumption is doing well, but the households, maybe we can say, are not doing it. It's not a sustainable level of consumption for them because they're really making sacrifices. Actually, I wanna also maybe ask, like, in terms of in NES, if you were to see a similar trend, a similar type of data, how would you think what are the factors that you would think of to explain this, if you saw it in a group of say IDPs in NES? I'd say like how would they, like, if you saw a similar data in Northeast Syria, how would you explain it, or what are the factors that you would think of as people who are working there? Like, you would, they know the situation there, maybe, like, why, and you saw it in a study of IDPs there, like, how would you think to explain it?
يعني لو انتم كنتوا بنفس الريزلت اللي عم تطلع لكم هلا هون موجوده في شمال شرق سوريا مع كل هدول الاي دي بيز موجودين او النازحين، ايش بكون في عندك، ايش الاسباب اللي خلتهم توصل لهي المرحله غير الكوفيد والاشياء اللي صارت معنا؟ بس ايش في اسباب ثانيه ممكن تدهور امورهم او امنهم الغذائي؟ ايه اللي تشاركونا اكثر؟ يعني بدنا حدا يشارك اكثر. شيرين، سعاد، علي. علي معنا. شو رايكم يا جماعه؟ او تشرحوا لنا الوضع هناك اكثر كيف؟ إغلاق المعابر يمكن يكون سبب. There's a border closure. It might be also a reason. علي saying. Okay. There is no diversity in food or different food groups as entering the country. And no problem, Aisha. And there is an increase in the population because of IDPs. So there's some IDP. And Ali saying the exchange rate increased, the currency, how it's depreciated. And Suad, I think, was raising, Suad or Shireen was raising her hand.
أستاذ، هو ارتفاع سعر الصرف يعني أثر بشكل كبير. ارتفاع الأجارات عنا، يعني عدد النازحين اللي اجوا، يعني عدد النازحين صار أكثر. كمان مشكلة المياه خاصة بمدينة الحسكة، إنه الناس صارت يعني تشتري المي، فهذا أكيد رح يقلل يعني من مصروفهم على الأكل.
This is a good one, actually, because there's the water problem now in Hasake. What happened? The people now are buying the bottle or the water from the market rather than, so they're spending more money on there. In addition to all that stuff, is like that's just from the IDPs, the depreciation of the currency, and also the cost of importing food. It's high, and also the security situation of the area is unstable. Yeah.
Yeah, so this is all like really good reasons, and it's why it's so difficult to sometimes. I mean, it's also important to note that each of these reasons are valid reasons why we might see something happen, and so it's when you're reporting on food security, we have to take into account other sources of information. For example, often we have reports about border closures. And so we can have this hypothesis, and then we maybe go to the data to say, on border closures and say, okay, is the border transit hard at this time? Was there a temporary COVID lockdown at this time? Was there a big displacement that, you know, if we're surveying a camp and all of a sudden a bunch of people, because of security situation, influx to the camp, now the population went up. So each of these reasons, you know, we have to think about what the situation, what the context is to try to pull them out. And we can't say for sure this is what happened, right? Usually it's many reasons, but we can give a sense of the context that can help us understand both why the food security indicator is the way it is, and also what can we do about it? What can we recommend to agencies who are acting, or what can we recommend within our own agency? This is what we need to do given this data. Always depends on the context. So
also adding to what you said, there's many factors. That's why many times a qualitative follow-up is an essential.
Yes.
For the study to clear actually these factors are the reasons. Okay. Also, Ali wanted to add also, now they're spending more money on non-food, which is like water stuff, which is how Shireen said, and rents, and also for electricity. They're paying more there. كمان الحظر الكلي اللي كان عم يصير بالمنطقة، كان أصحاب المشاريع عم يتوقفوا عن العمل. هذا الشيء also because of the full lockdown what happened in northeast Syria, it affected the business owners, people and their employment status, and of course this would affect access to Yes.
Yeah, exactly. And that's again why it's important to bring it full circle to what we started with. What is your sample? What is the group of people that you're trying to say something about? Where do they live? When is the data gathered? When are you actually seeing the consumption? Maybe you see food consumption go down in March, and then you're reporting. It takes a little time, right, to report this stuff. So you see it go down in March, but then in April, a lockdown is enacted. But we have to be thinking then about, okay, we saw this in March. It definitely can't be this lockdown that happened in April because we got the data before that. So always go back also to those things about when did we sample, where did we sample, who are we actually talking about, what's impacting their life. And as you build that together, you can start to build a story. And also I think qualitative is important, is crucial, because you can think about this story now, and you can ask people, okay, why did this situation happen for you, and verify if your story is correct or not. And then from there, you can report and also help make decisions about what to do with that information.
كان برضه امتى بنجمع الداتا، او وقت تجميع الداتا برضه كثير مهم. يعني the timing and the period of data is very important. Added to that is what happened in F-sum. Remember, whenever we had why the camps improved, while in reality they didn't improve, but at the same time there was like many assistance happening in the period for the camps, in the period of F-sum quarter 3 or the last quarter. So that was captured in the qualitative. Although also because كان عم بيحكي انه qualitative is also an essential to complement what we have results in the quantitative. كنت عم بحكي لكريس انه برضه في عندنا كان دراسه مع WFP الاردن بشهر 9 شفنا الحاله اللاجئين اللي عايشين بالمخيمات كثير تراجع وضعهم. بعدين بشهر 11 لما عملنا الكوارتر الاخير الربع الاخير من التقييم تحسن وضعهم شوي. هلا ما تحسن كثير طبعا، لساته كان سيء بس تحسن. بس احنا عم نعرف انه الظروف ما تحسنت. طب كيف تحسن وضعهم؟ بهاي الفتره اللي تم تجميع، عملنا كواليتيتيف طبعا وقتها، بهاي الفتره طلعوا عم بياخذوا مساعدات كثير كبيره. كانت في عندك مساعدات الشتويه ومساعدات الغاز وكل هاي الاشياء كلها اجت بنفس فتره ما عملنا التقييم، في هيك ادى انه كانوا يستخدموها للغذاء. فعرفتوا فالفتره كثير مهمه انكم تختاروا امتى انتم تجمعوا هاي الداتا. We always try to avoid seasonality. يعني زي ما حكينا اول مره رمضان هذا a big no انه نعمل data collection for food security. عيد it's a big no. After عيد within 2 weeks برضه we can start after 2 weeks from Eid but not within the 2 weeks after Eid. Okay, so there is some for even agricultural seasonality it might affect, yeah, but not as much as there are other factors. مثلا there are some factors that is out of our control like COVID. We don't have any control of it, but we know that there are some seasons we can control and we can avoid data collection. يعني في بعض المواسم احنا خلص نلغيها. يعني صار في عندنا حاله انه طارئه انه لازم نجمع الداتا بهاي الفتره. فاحنا حكينا رمضان رح يبلش 13/4، فعملنا المستحيل انه نقدر نجمع الداتا قبل رمضان. احنا عارفين رمضان رح ياثر كثير 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 على مؤشرات الامن الغذائي. تمام. في حدا عنده سعاد she's typing and see if she wanna add anything else to it so we can wrap up everything and finish the training.
No, Ahmed, nothing from my side. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Saad. Thank you. I don't know, Chris, if you want to add anything else to it. And thank you, guys. I know today, I don't know, maybe everyone is tired. Maybe there's some connection problems. But يعني we're glad that we finished the training. For now, يعني إن شاء الله if you're gonna do anything related to food security or anything, you're gonna be able at least to know how to estimate, calculate, and interpret these results. Tamam? Chris, if you want to add anything to that.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. Inshallah, you'll be informed consumers of food security data and also hopefully producing it. We're all, it's been a pleasure to work with you all and to help hopefully increase your knowledge. And please, if you have questions or things like that, let us know. We love, or maybe I shouldn't put us on that team. I love to think about this stuff. So, always feel free to reach out to any questions.
شكرا.
Thank you, everybody.
طلع احنا I think we're all done. يعطيكم الف عافيه يا جماعه وشكرا كثير.
يعطيك العافيه احمد، كريس وهنوف، وشكرا لكم جميعا انكم حضرتوا معنا التريننج. كان صراحه جدا ممتع.
الصراحه ممكن ارد على علي بس شغله علي. هلا التقرير it's really hard to send the report لانه still we are working on it and it's private for WFP Jordan. كثير صعب نبعث هذا التقرير، ولكن السنتكس امبارح بعثته لصلاح وان شاء الله صلاح رح يوزعه عليكم كلكم ان شاء الله. تمام؟ اوكي سوري صلاح انا قطعتك.
صحيح، السنتكس احمد بعث لي اياهم، حبعث لكم اياهم هم والفيديو ان شاء الله. وتذكروا انه في عندنا كمان بعثت لكم الكالندر، في عندنا تريننجز كمان بشهر طالع بشهر 5 وبشهر 6 كمان تريننجز. ولما حكينا كمان اليوم عن السامبلينج، تريننج عن السامبلينج، فراجعوا الكالندر وخليكم متفاعلين معنا. ويعطيكم الف عافيه جميعا وان شاء الله بنشوفكم على خير. شكرا كثير.
يلا مع السلامه يا جماعه، شكرا كثير.